She never sank a single enemy ship. She fired her main guns in anger exactly once in her entire career, at a weather station, and yet she held an empire hostage for nearly 3 years. This is the story of the Tirpitz, the heaviest battleship ever built by a European navy, a vessel so feared that entire fleets were rerouted. Entire convoys were scattered to the wolves of the deep, and the combined air power of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force was thrown against her, again and again, in raids that often failed at enormous cost. She was not a weapon, she was a fact, a cold, immovable, iron fact anchored in the black water of a Norwegian fjord. And the fact of her existence changed the war. Stay with me tonight. Settle in. We are going all the way back to the drawing tables of Wilhelmshaven in the 1930s, to the political calculations of men who built machines far too large for the wars they were planning, and forward through years of bombs, midget submarines, daring raids, and finally, on the 12th of November, 1944, to the end. By the time this is done, you will understand not just what the Tirpitz was, but why a ship that never fought became one of the most consequential vessels in the history of naval warfare. Chapter 1: The Weight of an Idea. Germany builds its monster. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself clearly. It arrives dressed in technical language, in displacement figures, in armor specifications, in the dry vocabulary of naval architects. But underneath that language, if you know how to read it, is something far more naked. It is the desire to be feared. The story of the Tirpitz begins not at the shipyard, but in the political ruins of Germany after 1918. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted the German navy with deliberate precision, limiting the country to vessels of no more than 10,000 tons, banning submarines entirely, and reducing what had once been one of the most powerful fleets in the world to a collection of coastal patrol craft. For the men who had served in that fleet, and for the officers who had watched the surrender, the humiliation was not abstract. It was measured in steel. And when the political order in Germany began to collapse in the late 1920s and early 1930s, those men found a government that was not merely willing to rearm. It was hungry to. The design process for what would eventually become the Tirpitz is worth slowing down over because it tells you something important about how great warships get built. The first studies, drawn up around 1934, envisioned a ship of roughly 35,000 tons, armed with 8 33-centimeter guns. That figure, 35,000 tons, was not chosen for engineering reasons. It was chosen because it was the upper limit imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty, the international agreement that had governed battleship construction since 1922. Germany was not even a signatory to that treaty. The figure was chosen so that the ships would appear, at least on paper, to be within the bounds of acceptable international behavior. In practice, both vessels of this class would secretly exceed that figure by a considerable margin. What forced the upgrade was a familiar dynamic in arms competition. Someone else moved first. France had begun construction of 2 Richelieu-class battleships in 1935, and the German Naval Construction Department revised its plans accordingly. This is one of the small but genuine historiographical debates around the Bismarck-class ships. To what extent was the final design driven by genuine strategic thinking? And to what extent was it simply a reflexive response to perceived French provocation? The honest answer is probably both, in roughly equal measure. The result, however, was that the ship that would eventually be named Tirpitz grew considerably larger, heavier, and more heavily armed than the original studies had indicated. the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935, which Britain foolishly hoped would constrain German naval expansion, actually gave Germany the legal cover it needed to begin construction on vessels in this class. The keel of the ship that would become Bismarck was laid down on the 1st of July, 1936, at the Hamburg shipyard of Blohm and Voss. Her sister ship, designated Schlachtschiff G in the yard records, which translates simply as Battleship G, was laid down just months later, on the 2nd of November 1936, at the Kriegsmarinewerft in Wilhelmshaven, the old Imperial Navy yard on the North Sea coast of Germany. The name on the slipway records is purely bureaucratic. There is no drama in those yard designations, no hint of what was coming, but the choice of the Wilhelmshaven yard for the second vessel was significant. It was the largest and best equipped military shipyard in Germany, and it had the physical infrastructure to handle a vessel of truly extraordinary size. The ship being assembled there would eventually displace 52,600 tons at full load. The name chosen for the vessel was a tribute to Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the man who had essentially created the modern German Navy from almost nothing in the decade and a half before the First World War. Alfred von Tirpitz was a genuine figure, gruff, strategically gifted, politically tenacious, and possessed of a beard so impressively pointed that contemporary photographs suggest he was aware of its theatrical value. He had served Kaiser Wilhelm II and built Germany's high seas fleet into a force large enough to challenge British naval dominance, which was precisely what made him so useful as a symbol to the men now building his namesake ship. He had died in 1930, 9 years before the vessel bearing his name was launched, and so could not witness the ceremony. But his daughter, Ilse von Hassel, was present at Wilhelmshaven on the 1st of April, 1939. The same day the Reich handed Grand Admiral Erich Raeder his ceremonial baton of office when she christened the ship and it slid into the water for the first time. Hitler himself was in attendance. The event was staged with the full weight of Third Reich ceremony, flags, speeches, the deliberate invocation of a military lineage designed to make the regime's naval ambitions look like the continuation of a proud tradition rather than what they actually were. The Tirpitz would not be commissioned into service for nearly 2 more years after that launch, fitting out the installation of armament, fire control systems, radar equipment, machinery, crew quarters, and the 1,000 other systems that turn a steel hull into a working warship. Continued through 1939 and 1940, interrupted repeatedly by Royal Air Force bombing raids on Wilhelmshaven. None of those raids struck the ship, but they slowed work, disrupted the schedule, and gave the men building the Tirpitz their first experience of being hunted. It was a preview of the years to come. She was formally commissioned into the German fleet on the 25th of February, 1941, at a cost, the yard records indicate, of 181 million Reichsmarks. For that sum, Germany had purchased not merely a battleship, but an argument. And the argument, as we shall see, was more powerful than the ship itself. The sheer physical statistics of the vessel deserve a moment of attention because they explain why she was simultaneously so feared and so difficult to use. At full load displacement, the Tirpitz weighed 52,600 tons, making her the heaviest warship ever built by a European navy, a record she holds to this day. She was 251 meters long overall, roughly 2.5 times the length of a modern football pitch. Her beam was 36 meters, 3 geared steam turbines, fed by 12 oil-fired boilers, drove her 3 propeller shafts and produced just over 160,000 shaft horsepower, giving her a maximum speed of 30 knots. Her standard crew numbered 103 officers and 1,962 enlisted men. In wartime, this rose to as many as 108 officers and 2,500 men. She was, in almost every measurable dimension, a city that could move. Her armament followed the standard Bismarck-class layout. 8 38-centimeter guns, that is to say, 15-inch guns in the Anglo-American measurement, were arranged in 4 twin turrets. The 2 forward turrets were named Anton and Bruno. The 2 aft turrets were named Caesar and Dora. These names were standard German naval practice for capital ship turrets, working through the German phonetic alphabet, and they recur throughout the Tirpitz's operational record so frequently that they become almost characters in the story, particularly Caesar and Dora, which feature in the most dramatic moments of her final hours. The main guns had a maximum range of roughly 36 kilometers and fired armor-piercing shells weighing approximately 800 kilograms. 12 15-centimeter secondary guns provided additional firepower against surface targets. 16 10.5-centimeter guns formed the heavy anti-aircraft battery, and over the course of the war, the light anti-aircraft complement was dramatically increased, eventually reaching 58 20mm guns. 8 53.3-centimeter torpedo tubes, installed during her Norway refit, were added to the mix in 1942. The fire control system used mechanical computers, analog calculating machines of considerable sophistication, to plot target courses and calculate firing angles. The entire apparatus was protected by belt armor, 320 millimeters thick, with turret faces armored to 360 millimeters. Against most of what the Allies had available in 1941, the Tirpitz was effectively impenetrable from the side. She also carried 4 Arado R-196 floatplanes, launched by a double-ended catapult mounted amidships, and recovered from the water by crane. This aerial reconnaissance capability was not a luxury in the Norwegian fjords, where visibility could be measured in meters and geography. Compressed every tactical calculation, the ability to put an observation aircraft over the horizon represented a genuine intelligence advantage. The Tirpitz was not just a gun platform, she was a system, a weapons system, an intelligence system, a logistical system, and above all, a psychological system. That last function, as it turned out, would prove to be by far the most important. What Germany could not provide, alongside all of this impressive hardware, was a coherent strategy for actually using it. Grand Admiral Raeder's ambitious Plan ZZ, the blueprint for a German fleet large enough to challenge Britain at sea, called for 10 battleships, 15 pocket battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 250 submarines, and more than 100 cruisers and destroyers, none of which would be ready before 1948. Britain declared war in September 1939. The Tirpitz was commissioned in February 1941. The gap between the fleet that existed and the fleet that had been planned was not a gap at all. It was an abyss, and into that abyss the Tirpitz would be launched, carrying the full weight of German naval ambition on a hull that was magnificent and alone. Chapter 2. Trials and the Shadow of Bismarck. The Baltic, 1941. There is always a period between a warship's commissioning and its first genuine deployment when the vessel and its crew are, in the most fundamental sense, learning each other. Systems that looked correct on paper turn out to behave unexpectedly at sea. Gun crews drill until the loading sequences become automatic. Navigation officers learn the particular handling characteristics of a hull that has never been pushed to its limits before. Engineers discover which boilers run slightly hot and which valves need attention at 2 in the morning. This is the unglamorous, essential work of turning a new warship into a functioning one. For the Tirpitz, this period stretched across the first months of 1941, and it took place in the Baltic Sea, waters that were, for a vessel of her size, barely adequate. Captain at Sea Carl Topp took command of the vessel at her commissioning on the 25th of February, 1941. Topp was a meticulous officer of the old German naval school, technically proficient, attentive to the details of ship management, and possessed of the particular steadiness that very large warships demand of their captains. The Baltic provided a protected body of water for trials, but it was shallow in places and geographically confined in ways that created real challenges for vessels drawing more than 9 meters at the stern. The sea trials conducted over the following months tested propulsion, steering, fire control, and communications, and by most accounts, the Tirpitz performed well. Her speed on trials was recorded at 30.8 knots, slightly above the designed figure, which was a source of satisfaction to the Wilhelmshaven yard. The crew that came aboard in February 1941 had been assembled from across the Kriegsmarine, many of them having served on smaller vessels or passed through naval training establishments. The challenge of manning a ship of this size was not simply numerical. It was organizational, coordinating over 2,000 men in a vessel that was, in effect, a small town required a bureaucratic structure as much as a military one. Different divisions of the crew had almost no regular contact with each other in the course of normal operations. The men who served the main battery turrets inhabited a different world from the engine room ratings, who fed the boilers or the radar operators in their enclosed spaces high in the ship's superstructure. In port, this could be managed by routine. At sea, under attack, the fragmentation of a large crew into isolated compartments was a genuine vulnerability that the Tirpitz's eventual fate would illustrate with grim clarity. While the Tirpitz conducted her trials in the Baltic, the war at sea was entering one of its most consequential phases. Germany's U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic was reaching the peak of what the submariners themselves called the First Happy Time, a period when merchant shipping losses were so severe that British planners were seriously calculating whether the island could be kept supplied. In this context, the German surface fleet occupied an ambiguous strategic position. The battleships and cruisers of the Kriegsmarine were potentially devastating commerce raiders, the kind of threat that forced Britain to divert warships from convoy protection to hunting duties. But they were also enormously expensive, difficult to replace, and vulnerable in ways that were not yet fully apparent to German naval planners in early 1941. The event that clarified the strategic situation at enormous cost was the sortie and loss of the Bismarck in May of that year. The Bismarck sailed from Gdynia on the 18th of May, 1941, as the centerpiece of Operation Rhine exercise, intended to raid Atlantic convoy routes. She sank the British battlecruiser HMS Hood on the 24th of May with a single catastrophic hit that detonated Hood's magazine, a loss so shocking to the British public that it triggered a pursuit involving virtually every major warship the Royal Navy had available in the North Atlantic. The Bismarck was found, crippled by aerial torpedo attack, and sunk on the 27th of May, 1941. She had been at sea for 9 days. The loss of the Bismarck is not a footnote to the Tirpitz's story. It is the structural fact around which the Tirpitz's entire operational existence was organized. Hitler, who had never been entirely comfortable with his Navy's surface raiding strategy, received the news of his flagship battleship's loss with visible distress and immediately imposed restrictions on the remaining capital ships. The Tirpitz was the Bismarck's sister ship, built on the same plans, essentially the same vessel in most important respects, and she was the only battleship Germany now possessed that was even comparable in capability to what had just been lost. The idea of committing her to North Atlantic raiding, which had already been under consideration, effectively died with the Bismarck. Hitler's instinct was to protect what remained. Raiders' professional judgment, never as reckless as Hitler's political instincts, leaned in the same direction. The question was what to do with a weapon you were afraid to use. The answer came partly from geography and partly from Hitler's peculiar strategic anxieties about Norway. Throughout 1941, even as the Tirpitz continued her Baltic trials, the German High Command was wrestling with a persistent fear that the Western Allies would attempt a seaborne invasion of Norway. The evidence for this fear was thin. The Allies had enough problems elsewhere without opening a Norwegian front. But Hitler's conviction was genuine and recurring. He described Norway as a zone of destiny, a phrase that says a great deal about the quality of his strategic thinking. From his perspective, a powerful battleship based in Norwegian waters served multiple purposes. It threatened Allied Arctic convoys, it deterred invasion, and, crucially, it did not require him to risk it in open ocean combat. It could sit in a fjord and be dangerous simply by existing. The concept had a formal name in naval theory: fleet in being. In practice, it would define the Tirpitz's war entirely. In the Baltic, meanwhile, the Tirpitz was briefly deployed in a more active role than she would ever again be asked to play. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, a temporary Baltic fleet was assembled to prevent the breakout of Soviet warships based at Leningrad. The Tirpitz was made flagship of this squadron, which included the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, several light cruisers, destroyers, and minesweepers. The fleet, under Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax, patrolled off the Åland Islands from the 23rd to the 26th of September 1941. No major engagement occurred. The Soviet Baltic Fleet, for reasons of its own, did not attempt to break out in force. The Tirpitz fired her guns at a converted target ship, the old pre-dreadnought Hessen, in gunnery practice, and otherwise continued her training routine. It was, in retrospect, the last time she would operate in anything approaching normal offensive conditions for the remainder of her existence. The British did not leave the Baltic period entirely uncontested. The RAF continued to launch bombing raids on the Tirpitz at Kiel throughout 1941. None of these raids scored hits. They were, in some respects, more significant as intelligence signals than as genuine threats. They told German naval commanders that Britain was watching the Tirpitz closely and considered her a high priority. This awareness fed directly into the planning for her Norwegian deployment. If the Royal Air Force was willing to send bombers to Kiel, where the defences were formidable and the target was well inland, what would happen when the Tirpitz moved to the more exposed Norwegian coast? The answer, as it turned out, was that it would try even harder at even greater cost for nearly 3 more years. But in the autumn of 1941, as Raeder drew up his proposal for the Norwegian deployment, that future was not yet written. It was only foreseeable, and only if you knew how much the British feared the Tirpitz and how far they were prepared to go to destroy her. Captain Top pronounced the vessel ready for combat operations on the 10th of January, 1942. 4 days later, she departed for what would be her permanent station. The Baltic trials were over. The Fjord years. Years of concealment, waiting, and the strange psychological war of a weapon that wins by never being fired were about to begin. Chapter 3. Into the Fjords. Arrival in Norway. January 1942. The departure from Wilhelmshaven on the 14th of January 1942 was conducted at 11 o'clock at night. This was not an accident. The Germans were well aware by this point that British intelligence had penetrated their communications sufficiently to track major naval movements, and the darkness of a winter night in the North Sea offered at least the possibility of concealment. The Tirpitz was escorted by 4 destroyers, the Richard Beitzen, the Paul Jacobi, the Bruno Heinemann, and Z-29, and the movement was given the operational name Polar Knights, which, in the operational naming conventions of the Second World War, is one of the more accurately descriptive code names on record. The North Sea in January is as close to an elemental hostility as peacetime Europeans ever encounter. For a battleship crew accustomed to the relative shelter of the Baltic, the passage north and into Norwegian waters was itself a kind of test. British intelligence, reading the Enigma decrypts, knew the Tirpitz had sailed. Admiral John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the British Home Fleet, was one of the most experienced and capable senior officers in the Royal Navy, and the news of the Tirpitz's departure immediately raised his concern level. But the weather over northern Britain in those days was brutal. The kind of weather that grounds aircraft, disrupts operations, and generally conspires against the best-laid plans of naval commanders. By the time Tovey received confirmation of the ship's departure, on the 17th of January, she had already arrived in Norway. The window for interception had closed before it properly opened. It was the first of many instances in which the Tirpitz's luck and Britain's frustration would be shaped as much by the weather as by strategy. The Tirpitz dropped anchor in the Trondheim area on the 16th of January, 1942, and within days had moved to her actual mooring in Fettenfjord, a narrow arm of the Trondheim Fjord running northeast from the city. The choice of anchorage was not arbitrary. Raeder, who had served as captain of the Kaiser's yacht before the First World War and had personal knowledge of the Norwegian coast, had identified the fjords around Trondheim as offering exceptional natural protection. Fettenfjord in particular had characteristics that made it nearly ideal for concealing and protecting a large warship. The fjord was narrow enough that approaching aircraft would have to fly directly into the guns of the ship's anti-aircraft batteries, with no room for the wide circling approaches that gave torpedo bombers their best attack geometry. The cliffs along one side of the fjord provided natural cover against attacks from the southwest. The depth of the water was sufficient to moor a vessel of the Tirpitz's draft, but not so deep as to complicate the installation of anti-submarine and anti-torpedo netting. The German installation of defences around the Fettenfjord anchorage was thorough and methodical. Anti-torpedo nets were strung around the Tirpitz at a distance of roughly 100 meters. Heavy steel booms were installed at the entrance to the anchorage. Shore-based anti-aircraft batteries were established at multiple positions around the surrounding hillsides, providing overlapping fields of fire. Junkers Ju-88 fast bombers and Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers were stationed at nearby airfields, available for defensive operations and for striking at any attacking fleet. The crew was put to work, cutting down trees on the surrounding hillsides and placing the branches and foliage aboard the ship and around her superstructure, providing a crude but effective camouflage that broke up the unmistakable silhouette of the hull from aerial observation. The Tirpitz also had available to her a system for generating artificial fog using a mixture of water and chlorosulfuric acid, which could be released from shore installations to blanket the entire anchorage in a thick chemical cloud within minutes of an air raid warning. It was an extraordinary amount of effort devoted to the art of hiding. The Norwegian resistance, which was already operating with impressive effectiveness, less than 2 years after the German occupation, transmitted the Tirpitz's location to London almost immediately. The British were thus aware of exactly where the ship was anchored, what the defensive arrangements looked like, and roughly what it would take to reach her. What they were not yet certain of was precisely how to get bombs or torpedoes onto a target that was, in every meaningful sense, designed to be bomb and torpedo proof. This uncertainty would drive British planning for the next 2 years and would consume resources in aircraft, aircrew, submarines, and specialized weapons on a scale that, in retrospect, seems almost disproportionate to the military value of a single ship that rarely moved and never engaged. Almost. The reason it was not disproportionate is the same reason the Tirpitz had value in the first place. The possibility, however remote, that she might sail. The discovery of the Tirpitz in Trondheim caused immediate and lasting disruption to British naval dispositions. Admiral Tovey was required to maintain a significant force in Scapa Flow, the great anchorage in the Orkney Islands that served as the home fleet's base, capable of intercepting the Tirpitz if she put to sea. This was not a small commitment. Keeping a battleship or battlecruiser on continuous readiness in Scapa Flow, with fuel, crew, and escort destroyers at hand, tied up resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The British were fighting simultaneously in the North Atlantic against the U-boat campaign, in the Mediterranean against German and Italian forces threatening the supply lines to Malta and Egypt, and in the Indian Ocean against Japan. Every ship held in the North Sea, in case the Tirpitz moved, was a ship that could not do something else. The Germans understood this calculation perfectly, and it was central to the value they placed on simply keeping the Tirpitz in existence. Life aboard the Tirpitz during this period is worth considering for a moment because the human dimension of the story is easy to lose in the strategic abstractions. The crew of 2,500 men, many of them in their late teens or early 20s, had trained for battle and found themselves assigned to a ship that did not fight. Routine dominated everything. Anti-aircraft watches were maintained continuously. The machinery had to be kept in readiness for sailing at short notice. Drills were conducted. The physical fitness regime that Captain Top maintained involved the crew being sent ashore for exercise, tree-cutting details, and sports activities. Fuel shortages, a recurring problem throughout the Norwegian period, frequently prevented the Tirpitz from conducting sea exercises, which meant that the crew's skills at the most demanding aspects of naval warfare atrophied, even as they drilled at the more static ones. The ship's nickname among those who knew of it was the Lonely Queen of the North, a phrase that captures something genuine about the combination of grandeur and isolation that defined her Norwegian years. For the young sailors aboard her, it was not a metaphor, it was the condition of their daily existence. The first real test of the new arrangement came barely 3 weeks after the Tirpitz settled into Fjords. In February 1942, the Tirpitz put to sea briefly as part of a deception operations designed to draw British attention away from the English Channel dash of the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen, Operation Cerberus. The movement of those three ships through the English Channel from Brest to German ports was one of the more audacious German naval operations of the war. It succeeded. The Tirpitz's sortie was intended to suggest to British intelligence that she was preparing a North Sea operation, keeping Tovey's attention divided. The stratagem appears to have contributed, at least marginally, to the British being caught off guard when the Channel Dash actually began. It was the first, and in many respects the clearest, demonstration of the Tirpitz's strategic value as a decoy, a warship whose most effective weapon was uncertainty. The Norwegian resistance informed London of her every movement, and the RAF never stopped planning its next attempt. But as the winter of 1942 deepened, and the anchorage's defences solidified around the great ship, those plans faced an increasingly well-defended target. The Lonely Queen was home, and she was not going anywhere easily. Chapter 4, The Fleet in Being, Operation Sports Palace, and the Ruin of Convoy PQ-17. In the vocabulary of naval strategy, the phrase fleet in being has a specific and rather elegant meaning. It describes a situation in which a naval force, even one that never engages, in battle, shapes the behavior of the enemy simply by existing and maintaining the capability to act. The concept dates to the late 17th century, but it has never been illustrated more starkly in modern warfare than by the Tirpitz's presence in the Norwegian fjords. The British could not ignore her. They could not afford to leave the Arctic convoy routes unguarded against the possibility that she might sail. And so, for as long as the Tirpitz remained afloat and capable, an enormous fraction of British naval planning was organised around a ship that, in operational terms, was doing almost nothing. The spring of 1942 brought the first serious attempt to actually use the Tirpitz in the role for which she had been deployed. The interception of Allied Arctic convoys. These convoys, which ran from Iceland or Scotland northward around Norway's North Cape and then east to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, were one of the more strategically important and physically punishing supply routes in the entire war. The Arctic environment, perpetual darkness in winter, perpetual daylight in summer, sea ice, violent storms, temperatures at which men in the water died within minutes, made every convoy run a test of endurance, and the geography of the route placed the convoys within range of German forces based in Norway for the majority of their passage. For the Germans, these convoys were a target of real strategic value. Cutting them would reduce the flow of weapons, vehicles, and raw materials to the Soviet Union at a time when the Eastern Front was still in genuine doubt. In early March of 1942, the Tirpitz, along with the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer and 4 destroyers, put to sea as part of Unternehmen Sportpalast, Operation Sports Palace, intended to intercept 2 Allied convoys simultaneously, the homebound QP-8 and the outbound PQ-12. The operation was plagued by problems from the outset. The Admiral Scheer's design speed was only 26 knots, too slow to operate effectively alongside the Tirpitz, and she was left behind. Enigma intercepts had already alerted British intelligence to the sortie, allowing Admiral Tovey to reroute the convoys. The Tirpitz sailed north and found nothing. An air attack launched against her on the 9th of March by 12 Fairey Albacore torpedo bombers from HMS Victorious was evaded. The Tirpitz successfully combed the torpedo tracks, and only 3 sailors were wounded. The Tirpitz shot down 2 British aircraft in return. She returned to Trondheim on the 13th of March without having engaged any surface vessel. The failure of Operation Sports Palace marked the effective end of the Tirpitz's usefulness. as an active convoy raider. The combination of Enigma intelligence and the geography of the Norwegian coast, which limited exit routes and created choke points where British submarines and aircraft could concentrate, made it increasingly difficult for the Germans to sortie without being detected and countered. Subsequent RAF bombing raids in March and April 1942, while again failing to hit the ship, demonstrated the willingness of Bomber Command to absorb significant losses in the attempt. On the night of the 30th to the 31st of March, 33 Halifax bombers attacked Fjord without scoring a single hit, losing 5 aircraft. Raids on the 27th to 28th of April, involving 31 Halifaxes and 12 Lancasters, cost 5 more bombers. A follow-up raid the next night, with 23 Halifaxes and 11 Lancasters, cost 2 more. These are not trivial numbers. Each bomber carried a crew of 6 or 7 men, and many of those who did not return from these raids are buried in Norwegian soil or rest on the floor of Norwegian waters. The British public was not told the scale of the losses. The Tirpitz remained undamaged, the most consequential episode in the Tirpitz's Norwegian career. In many respects, the moment that most clearly illustrates the terrible logic of the fleet in being concept came in the summer of 1942 with the fate of convoy PQ-17. The convoy left Iceland on the 27th of June, bound for Archangel, carrying a cargo of extraordinary importance: tanks, aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, material that the Soviet Union needed desperately as German forces pushed deep into Russian territory. The convoy consisted of 34 merchant ships, escorted by a powerful naval force that include the battleships HMS Duke of York and USS Washington, the carrier HMS Victorious, cruisers, and destroyers. The Germans assembled a powerful surface force for the interception, designated Unternehmen Russelsprung, Operation Knight's Move. The Tirpitz led a task force out of Trondheim. A second task force, including Lutzow and Admiral Scheer, operated from the Narvik area. The operation immediately began to unravel. Lutzow and 3 destroyers struck uncharted rocks while en route to the rendezvous point and had to turn back. The Soviet submarine K-21 fired torpedoes at the Tirpitz. All missed, though Soviet reports later claimed otherwise. Most critically, Swedish intelligence, which had detected the German naval movements, reported the sortie to the British Admiralty. What happened next was one of the most controversial decisions in British naval history. The Admiralty, based on the intelligence that a powerful German surface force, including the Tirpitz, was at sea, and apparently heading for the convoy, issued a series of orders that first told the convoy's close escort to withdraw westward, then ordered the convoy to disperse. The convoy commodore received the order to scatter at around 9 o'clock on the evening of the 4th of July, 1942. The merchant ships, which had been keeping close foes formation, precisely because that offered mutual protection, spread out across hundreds of miles of open Arctic Ocean. And the Tirpitz, in one of the great ironies of the entire war, turned back before ever reaching the convoy. German High Command, aware that British forces were tracking them and concerned about the risk to the ship, cancelled the operation. The Tirpitz returned to Altafjord without firing a shot. 21 of the 34 merchant ships in convoy PQ-17 were subsequently sunk by German aircraft and submarines. The scattered vessels, stripped of their escorts, could no longer defend each other. The losses were devastating, not just in ships and cargo, but in the lives of merchant seamen who died in Arctic waters, waiting for rescue that was often too slow in coming. And the Tirpitz, which had never approached within engagement range of the convoy, was directly responsible, not because she fired her guns, she did not, but because her existence had generated a threat assessment so alarming that the British Admiralty panicked and scattered the very ships they had been trying to protect. Historians have debated the Admiralty's decision ever since, and the debate is genuinely unresolved. Some argue that the intelligence picture available to the Admiralty on the 4th of July was genuinely alarming, and that the decision, while catastrophic in outcome, was defensible in context. Others contend that the scattering order reflected a failure of nerve, an excessive deference to the threat posed by a single ship, and that a convoy, which had already survived in formation through the most dangerous part of its route, should not have been dispersed based on incomplete intelligence about German intentions. What is not in dispute is the scale of the disaster, or the fact that the Tirpitz achieved, by threatening to act, a more devastating blow to Allied Arctic convoys than any surface engagement she could plausibly have won. She was never more dangerous than in the hours when she was turning back for port. The aftermath of PQ-17 effectively ended the Arctic convoy program temporarily. The British suspended further sailings for the remainder of the summer of 1942. The Tirpitz underwent a major overhaul in Trondheim. The defences of the Fjord anchorage were doubled, and a caisson was constructed around the stern to allow the replacement of the ship's rudders. Hitler replaced Ryder with Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz on the 30th of January 1943, following his dissatisfaction with the surface fleet's handling of the Battle of the Barents Sea, an engagement in which German cruisers and destroyers had performed poorly against a British convoy escort. The age of the German surface raider was effectively over, but the Tirpitz remained, moored, maintained, and menacing, because the cost of simply keeping her there, at least from the German perspective, was lower than the cost of admitting she could not be used. Chapter 5. The One Fight. Spitsbergen, September 1943. There is something almost melancholy about the fact that the most powerful battleship ever built by a European navy fired her main guns in combat on exactly one occasion in her entire operational life, and that occasion was a raid on a weather station. This is not a judgment on the men who served aboard the Tirpitz, or on the German naval officers who planned the operation. It is simply a reflection of the strategic situation that had developed by the autumn of 1943. A situation in which the Tirpitz's value as a latent threat was so great that expending it in actual combat was almost never considered worth the risk. But circumstances and the particular frustrations of a fleet that had been largely idle for 18 months occasionally forced the issue. By the spring of 1943, the Tirpitz had been joined in the Norwegian fjords by the battleship Scharnhorst. Vice Admiral Oskar Kumetz had been given command of the warships stationed in Norway. The arrival of the Scharnhorst offered the possibility, at least in theory, of combined operation. Two capital ships working together would be significantly harder for the British to counter than the Tirpitz alone. But Allied Arctic convoys had temporarily ceased in the summer of 1940 following the PQ-17 disaster, and had resumed only in December. The convoys ran through the winter of 1942 to 43, but then paused again. When they resumed, the threat calculus had shifted. More powerful escorts, better intelligence, and a growing understanding on both sides of the risks involved made major surface interceptions increasingly unattractive to German planners. The operation that finally gave the Tirpitz her one moment of genuine combat was conceived as something between a military operation and a demonstration a way to give the expensive fleet in being a tangible success to justify its existence. The target was Spitsbergen, the Norwegian archipelago in the high Arctic, where Britain had established a small weather station and refueling base defended by a garrison of 152 men from the Norwegian armed forces in exile. The operation was approved by Hitler in early September 1943. On the 6th of September, the Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, escorted by 10 destroyers, left port. The approach to Spitsbergen was made with a degree of deception that suggests German planners were somewhat self-conscious about the nature of the operation. On the approach to the island, the Tirpitz reportedly flew a white naval ensign rather than the German battle flag, a stratagem designed to create momentary confusion among the defenders. The bombardment began on the 7th of September. The Tirpitz fired 52 rounds from her main battery, those 8 15-inch guns that had been loaded, trained, and ready for 2 years, and 82 rounds from her 15-centimeter secondaries. The shore installations were destroyed. The following day, a landing party of German soldiers went ashore, destroyed what remained, and captured 74 prisoners. The Norwegian garrison put up resistance, but the disparity of force was absolute. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the battleships had completed their work and headed south. Hitler, who had been watching the operation with considerable interest, could at last point to something his expensive surface ships had accomplished. From a military perspective, the Spitsbergen operation was a complete success in its limited objectives. It destroyed the British weather installation, removed an Arctic refueling point, and gave the crew of the Tirpitz and the crew of the Scharnhorst the experience of a genuine, if lopsided, combat action. For the men aboard, many of whom had spent the better part of 2 years waiting for exactly this kind of engagement, it was at minimum a demonstration that the ship they served could actually do what it had been built to do. Whether it justified the cost of maintaining the fleet in Norway is a different question entirely. A weather station is not a strategic target of the first order. 74 prisoners taken from a garrison of 152 do not alter the balance of the war. But in the psychology of the Tirpitz's Norwegian years, the Spitsbergen raid occupies a specific and somewhat poignant place. The one fight, the one proof of concept, the single occasion when the lonely Queen of the North was something other than a threat and became, however briefly, a weapon. It is worth noting that this was not merely a German perception. British intelligence, tracking the operation through a combination of Norwegian resistance reports and signals intercepts, registered the Spitsbergen raid with genuine concern. Not because the operation was strategically significant in itself, but because it demonstrated that the Tirpitz and Scharnhorst were still operational, still capable of putting to sea, and still willing to use their guns when the opportunity presented itself. The fear was that a more significant target, a convoy, a port facility, a naval installation, might be next. This concern fed directly into the acceleration of British planning for the next major operation against the Tirpitz, which was already under preparation before the smoke from the Spitsbergen bombardment had cleared. The British response to the Spitsbergen raid was not to launch another air attack. The accumulated evidence of failed bombing raids made clear that conventional aerial bombing was not going to solve the problem. Instead, the Royal Navy turned to a technology that was, in 1943, almost entirely without precedent in the history of naval warfare: the midget submarine. The X-Craft program had been under development for some time, but the particular logic of the Tirpitz's anchorage made midget submarines attractive. in ways that did not apply to most targets. The ship was protected against aircraft by the fjord geography and her anti-aircraft batteries. She was protected against conventional submarines by her anti-torpedo nets and the shallow, narrow waters of the anchorage. She was protected against surface attack by every measure the Germans could devise. But a vessel small enough to slip beneath the torpedo netting and lay its charges directly under the hull, that was a different proposition entirely. The planning for Operation Source, the midget submarine attack, had been underway since early in the year. The Spitsbergen raid, by demonstrating that the Tirpitz was operational and her crew was active, simply added urgency to what was already being prepared. The Tirpitz returned from Spitsbergen to her anchorage at Kofjord in Altafjord. She had moved north from Trondheim earlier in the year, in good condition. The crew was in better spirits than they had been in months. The ship had performed flawlessly. The guns had fired. The machinery had held, and if the target had been modest, well, there would be other targets. The Arctic convoys were running again. The Eastern Front, despite enormous German casualties, was not yet fully turned against Germany in September 1943. The strategic picture from inside the steel walls of the Tirpitz was sobering but not desperate. What happened 17 days later would change all of that. Operation Source began on the 20th of September 1943, and the Lonely Queen was about to discover that the threat she had never been able to see was more dangerous than all the bombs and torpedoes that had been thrown at her from above. Chapter 6, Operation Source, the Midget Submarine Strike, September 1943. The X-craft were not impressive objects to look at. Each one was roughly 15 meters long, displaced about 30 tons, and was powered by a single diesel engine on the surface and an electric motor submerged. They carried no conventional torpedoes. Their weapons were 2 large ground mines, each weighing 2 tons, carried externally in saddle tanks on either side of the hull, designed to be released while the submarine was positioned directly beneath its target and set to detonate after a time delay. The crew was 4 men, a commanding officer, a first lieutenant, an engineer, and a diver who could exit the boat through a small chamber to cut through anti-torpedo netting. The conditions inside an X-craft were extraordinary in their discomfort. Cramped, wet, poorly lit, and subject to the kind of psychological pressure that small enclosed spaces create in ways that cannot be entirely simulated in training. These were not the kind of ships that inspire postcards or appear in paintings of great naval engagements. They were working tools built for a specific purpose, and that purpose was to go where nothing larger could go and leave a very large explosion behind. 10 X-craft were assigned to Operation Source. Each was towed across the North Sea and into Norwegian waters by a conventional fleet submarine. The passage was too far for the X-craft to make under their own power, and the towing cables were a source of constant anxiety throughout the transit, as the rough seas of the Northern Passage put enormous strain on both the towing and the towed vessels. The operation was scheduled to take place between the 20th and the 25th of September 1943. The 3 primary targets were the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser Lutzow, all of which were anchored in or near Altafjord in northern Norway. Far north of the Trondheim area, where the Tirpitz had previously been based, a move that placed her even further from British air bases, and closer to the Arctic convoys she was nominally positioned to threaten. The passage was brutal. 2 of the 10 X-craft were lost in towing accidents before they reached their release points. The remaining 8, cast off from their towing submarines, and began the final approach to their targets under their own power, navigating through some of the most demanding waters in the world. The network of Norwegian inner leads, where the charts were imperfect, the tidal streams were unpredictable, and the risk of detection increased with every kilometre travelled. 3 of the boats assigned to the Tirpitz, X5, X6, and X7, made it to Fjords and breached the outer defensive perimeter. The other targets were less fortunate. The operations against Scharnhorst and Lutzow both failed before reaching their objectives, for various reasons of mechanical failure and adverse circumstances. X5, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Henty Creer, was detected 200 meters from the anti-torpedo nets surrounding the Tirpitz, and was sunk by gunfire and depth charges before it could plant its mines. What happened next is one of those historiographical questions that the available evidence does not fully resolve. It is unclear whether X5 had already released its mines before being detected, or whether they went down with the boat. The British post-war assessment concluded that X5's mines probably did not reach the target. X6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, successfully passed through the nets, partly through a gap, partly by cutting, but was detected while trying to navigate the confined space of the anchorage and had to scuttle on the surface after releasing its mines. Cameron and his crew were captured. X7, commanded by Lieutenant Basil Place, also successfully penetrated the nets and released its mines, but was subsequently caught in the nets while attempting to withdraw and was very badly damaged. Place and one surviving crew member eventually managed to escape. The German response to the appearance of midget submarines in their anchorage was initially confused. The Tirpitz's crew had detected something. The presence of X6 on the surface had been reported, but the exact nature of the threat was not immediately clear, and the time between the alarm and the explosions was short. The Germans attempted to move the Tirpitz away from the position where the mines had been laid, and she was, in fact, moving when the first charge detonated at approximately 8:32 in the morning, on the 22nd of September, 1943. A second detonation followed shortly after. The timing was simultaneous enough that, from inside the ship, the effect was of a single catastrophic event, an upwelling of force from below that lifted the ship and then dropped her back onto the water with the comb, violence that no one aboard had experienced before. The damage was extraordinary in its scope, and, in some respects, more alarming in its nature than in its immediate severity. The first mine had detonated abreast of turret Caesar. The second had exploded roughly 45 to 55 meters off the portbow. The explosions ruptured a fuel oil tank, tore shell plating, created a large indentation in the double bottom, and buckled the bulkheads in the double bottom of the port side. 1,430 tons of water-flooded fuel tanks and void spaces. All of the turbo generators in generator room number 2 were destroyed. Most of the generators in generator room number 1 were disabled by broken steam lines and severed power cables. The ship lost most of her electrical power in the minutes following the explosions. But the single most significant item of damage, the one that would shape repair planning for the next 6 months, and whose implications historians Garsky and Doolin describe as particularly significant, was what happened to turret Dora. The rear port main battery turret was thrown off its rotating bearings by the shock of the explosions. It could no longer be rotated, and there were no heavy lift cranes anywhere in Norway powerful enough to lift the turret and place it back on its bearings. This was not a detail that could be easily worked around. A battleship with a gun turret that cannot rotate has a significant and permanent gap in its armament. Replacing the turret required either transporting the Tirpitz back to Germany, which Hitler had forbidden, or bringing the repair equipment to Norway, which would take months. The repair ship Neumark was dispatched, and the work was eventually accomplished. But the process took until the 2nd of April 1944, more than 6 months, for the crews of the X-craft, 3 of whom, Cameron, Place, and others, survived to become prisoners of war. The operation was both a success and a cost. They had not sunk the Tirpitz, but they had put her out of action for 6 months, at a point in the war when 6 months mattered considerably. Both Cameron and Place were later awarded the Victoria Cross for their part in the operation, the highest award for valour in the British military. The X-craft crewmen who did not return, who are still with their boats in the cold black water of Fjords, received no award they could hold, but the operation they carried out changed the calculus of the Tirpitz campaign in ways that would only become apparent in the months that followed, when the British, knowing the battleship was damaged and under repair, began planning an attack of unprecedented scale and ambition. The midget submarines had done something that dozens of conventional bombers had failed to accomplish. They had found a way in. And now, with the Tirpitz immobilized and her crew working around the clock to restore her, the question was whether the repair ship Neumark could finish its work before the Royal Navy found a way to finish Tirpitz entirely. Chapter 7. Operation Tungsten. The Carrier Strike, April 1944. The 6 months that the Tirpitz spent under repair following the X-craft attack were not 6 months of British inactivity. They were 6 months of preparation, methodical, expensive, and driven by the knowledge that the ship would eventually be restored to fighting condition, and that the window of her relative vulnerability, while she sat immobile in Fjords, and her crew worked to undo the damage caused by 2 tons of amatol explosive detonating beneath her keel, was not unlimited. The Royal Navy had been planning a carrier-based strike against the Tirpitz since well before Operation Source. The success of the midget submarines in disabling the ship now made such a strike both more urgent and, paradoxically, more feasible. A ship that cannot maneuver freely is a more predictable target than one that can open her throttles and present a difficult angled shot to an approaching torpedo aircraft. The strike force assembled for Operation Tungsten was the largest concentration of British naval air power committed to a single target action up to that point in the war. The core of the force was 2 fleet carriers, HMS Victorious and HMS Furious, which together embarked roughly 40 Barracuda dive bombers from 827, 829, 830, and 831 naval air squadrons, along with substantial fighter escort provided by Corsairs, Hellcats, and Wildcats from 3 escort carriers. The overall force included 2 battleships, the Duke of York and Anson, and an escort of cruisers and destroyers, which were present partly to provide anti-aircraft cover, and partly because the threat of the Tirpitz's own guns required that any attacking force have some capacity to respond if she somehow managed to get underway. The planning, which had been revised several times to account for changing intelligence about the Tirpitz's repair status, settled on early April of 1944 as the target window, a period when the repair work would be sufficiently advanced that the Tirpitz was technically in commission again, but before she had been fully prepared for operational deployment. The Barracuda was not the most glamorous aircraft in the Royal Navy's inventory. It was, in fact, widely regarded by its crews as one of the more unpleasant aircraft to fly. Underpowered, prone to buffeting at low speeds, and possessed of a high gull wing that gave it an ungainly appearance that even its admirers conceded was not inspiring. But it could carry a variety of ordnance types, including 1,600-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs and smaller bombs fitted with instantaneous fuses, and it could deliver them in a steep dive that gave the pilot a better chance of placing his weapon accurately than a level bombing run. The question, which was not resolved until after the attack, was whether any bomb a Barracuda could carry was capable of penetrating the Tirpitz armoured deck. The attack went in at 05:29 on the 3rd of April, 1944. The Tirpitz was caught in the act of completing exercises. Her crew at action stations, but not yet fully deployed at the anti-aircraft batteries, her anti-aircraft guns not fully manned, and her smokescreen system not yet activated. This timing was not luck. British intelligence, including Norwegian resistance reports, had established something of a pattern in the Tirpitz's morning routine, and the strike planners had deliberately chosen the moment of shift change, when readiness at the gun positions was at its lowest. The first wave of 21 Barracudas screamed down from above the fjord walls in a matter of minutes. The Tirpitz artificial fog generators began to operate immediately on the alarm being given, but the reaction time required to fill the fjord with obscuring smoke was significantly longer than the time it took 21 aircraft to complete a dive bombing run. The first wave was on its way back before the smoke became effective. 14 bombs struck the Tirpitz in the two waves of the attack. This was a remarkable accuracy rate. Roughly 30% of the total bombs dropped for dive bombing under combat conditions. The damage was severe and in some respects dramatic. The forward superstructure and bridge area were hit multiple times. There were fires on deck, and the casualties, 122 killed and 316 wounded, were the highest the Tirpitz suffered in any single engagement throughout her entire existence. Captain Top, who had commanded the ship since commissioning, was among the wounded. From the perspective of the Barracuda crews making their attack runs, watching the bombs go off in the confined space of the fjord, with the cliffs on either side, it must have appeared devastating. The bomb damage, however, did not penetrate the Tirpitz's armoured deck. This is the central and frustrating finding of the post-attack assessment. The bombs that hit the ship did enormous damage to her unarmoured upper works, her superstructure, her anti-aircraft positions, and her crew. But they did not damage the main belt armour, the turrets, or the machinery spaces that determined whether the ship could be moved and whether her main armament could be brought to bear. The 1,600-pound semi-armour piercing bomb, which had been expected to do the most serious structural damage, detonated prematurely on the upper deck, plating in at least some instances, rather than penetrating before detonating. The Tirpitz was hurt. She was not crippled. Repair work began within days of the attack. 3 further carrier strike operations, Operations Planet, Brawn, and Tiger Claw, were attempted against the Tirpitz in the summer of 1944, all of them failing to damage her due to weather, timing difficulties, or the now rapid deployment of the artificial fog screen. Operation Mascot on the 17th of July, 1944, was perhaps the most frustrating of the failed attempts. 44 Barracudas and their escort reached the target area, but the smoke screen was fully deployed before the aircraft arrived, and not a single bomb found its mark. The planes had flown hundreds of kilometers, through Arctic weather and found nothing but a white chemical fog covering the surface of the fjord where the Tirpitz lay hidden. The mood aboard the returning carriers can be imagined without much difficulty. The pattern of partial successes, significant costs, and fundamental failure to destroy the target that characterized the carrier operations against the Tirpitz in 1944 was not lost on the planners in London. The problem was architectural. The Tirpitz was armored to withstand the largest shells a contemporary battleship could fire at close range. The bombs available to carrier-based aircraft were not powerful enough to defeat that armor in the dive. Delivery configuration that was possible from the fjord geometry. What was needed was either a weapon of dramatically greater penetrating power or a means of delivering the ship into a position where something more destructive could reach her. By the late summer of 1944, one of those options was becoming available. It had been designed for a different target entirely, but the men who built it quickly realized it was almost perfectly suited for what remained the most difficult bombing problem in Europe. The Tirpitz had survived Operation Tungsten, had survived Mascot, Planet, Brawn, and Tiger Claw. She had survived nearly 3 years of British effort. But the Barracuda raids had demonstrated one important thing that would prove fatal to her. Repeated attacks had quantified exactly how resistant she was to conventional ordnance, and that knowledge was now guiding the development of something she was not designed to survive. Chapter 8. The Tall Boy and the Men Who Flew It. Bomber Command's Longest Reach. In the summer of 1943, an aeronautical engineer named Barnes Wallis had delivered 2 remarkable achievements to the British war effort. The first was the bouncing bomb used by the famous Dambusters raid on the Ruhr dams in May of that year. The second was a theoretical paper on what Wallis called the earthquake bomb, a weapon of such mass and structural integrity that, dropped from a sufficient altitude, it would penetrate deep into the earth or the fabric of a reinforced structure before detonating, creating a shockwave propagating upward through the ground that was, in practical terms, impossible to armor against. The weapon Wallis envisioned was not a larger version of conventional bombs. It was a different kind of weapon based on a different theory of destruction. One that was informed by his background as an airship designer, which gave him an unusual understanding of structural loads and failure modes. The bomb that came out of this program was the Tall Boy, a weapon 5.4 meters long, weighing 5,440 pounds, and filled with a high explosive compound called Torpex, which had a blast equivalence roughly 50% greater than the same weight of TNT. The Tall Boy was not a bomb that any existing aircraft could carry. Only the Avro Lancaster, the largest and most capable heavy bomber in RAF service, had the payload capacity and the bomb bay dimensions to accommodate it. The Lancaster itself had to be modified. Various items of standard equipment were removed to reduce weight. The bomb bay doors were replaced with specially manufactured ones, and the bomb carriers were reinforced to hold the weapon securely. The Tall Boy was spin stabilized during flight by fins machined to very precise tolerances, and when dropped from the correct altitude, approximately 12,000 feet, it reached a speed close to the speed of sound before impact, giving it a terminal velocity and penetrating power far beyond any conventional aircraft bomb. The unit chosen to carry Tall Boys against the Tirpitz was 617 Squadron, Royal Air Force, the same unit that had been formed specifically for the Dams raid and had subsequently been employed on a series of precision bombing missions against hardened targets in occupied Europe. 617 Squadron had developed under the leadership of various commanding officers and under the extraordinary technical guidance of Barnes-Wallis and the target marking expertise of Bomber Command's Pathfinder units, a level of precision bombing skill that was unmatched anywhere in the Allied air forces at that stage of the war. They had attacked V-weapon sites in France, railway viaducts, and reinforced U-boat pens in Brest and Lorient, targets that had resisted every previous air attack precisely because their reinforced concrete construction was proof against conventional ordnance. The tall boy had cracked them. The Tirpitz, her designers confident in the thickness of her armour, had perhaps not fully considered an enemy capable of delivering an earthquake. The operational problem of reaching the Tirpitz from Britain with tall boys was considerable. The Tirpitz was anchored in Fjord in Fjord, the very northernmost part of mainland Norway, well above the Arctic Circle, more than 1,500 kilometres from the nearest British air bases. The Lancaster, even stripped of unnecessary weight and flying an optimized profile, could not carry a tall boy from Britain to Fjord and return. The range was simply beyond the aircraft's capability. The solution, proposed by the planning staff and accepted by the Air Ministry, was to use Soviet airfields. Russia's Arctic port of Yagodnik, near Archangel, could be reached from Britain, and Archangel was within striking range of Fjord. The aircraft would fly from Scotland, land at Yagodnik to refuel and complete final preparation, execute the raid on the Tirpitz, and then fly back, either to Russia or, if fuel permitted, directly home. This arrangement required a level of coordination with Soviet authorities that was, in practice, considerably more complicated than the plan made it sound. Relations between Britain and the Soviet Union, while nominally those of close allies, were marked by mutual suspicion, bureaucratic obstruction, and a persistent Soviet reluctance to allow foreign military units to operate freely from Soviet soil. The negotiations for basing rights took weeks. When the aircraft of 617 Squadron and 609 Squadron, which was attached for this operation, arrived at Yagodnik in September of 1944, they found facilities that were significantly below British operational standards, runway surfaces that were poor, accommodation that was basic, maintenance support that was minimal, and a general atmosphere of watchful Soviet bureaucracy that complicated every aspect of preparation. Several aircraft were damaged on landing at the Russian airfield. The operation, which had been planned with great precision in Scotland, now had to proceed from improvised circumstances in the Arctic. Operation Paravine, the first tall boy attack on the Tirpitz, took place on the 15th of September, 1944. 27 Lancasters set out from Yagodnik. 20 of them were carrying tall boys, and the remainder carried 1,000-pound conventional bombs as secondary weapons. The approach to the target was made at high altitude, and the weather over Fjord was clear enough, at least initially, to allow the bomb aimers to acquire the target visually. One tall boy struck the Tirpitz. It hit forward, near the bow, and it did exactly what Barnes-Wallis had designed it to do. It penetrated the armoured deck before detonating, opening an enormous hole in the bow section. The damage was, in the technical assessment prepared by German naval engineers immediately after the attack, severe enough that the Tirpitz was considered unlikely to be repaired to full operational standard within Norway. There were no dry docks in Norway capable of handling a vessel of her size for the kind of structural repair the Paravane damage required. German Naval Command, reviewing the damage assessment in September 1944, reached a conclusion that was simultaneously realistic and revealing. The Tirpitz could not be repaired to full fighting condition in Norway. The war situation did not permit her transfer to a German Baltic port for major reconstruction. The Kiel Canal, through which she would have to pass, was under increasing RAF attack, and the Baltic Sea itself was becoming a contested space as Soviet forces pressed toward the German coast. She could not be used as an active warship, but she could still be used as a floating battery, moored in a sheltered position, her guns operational, her hull sufficiently watertight to keep her above the surface. She could contribute to the defense of a strategic position. The position chosen was the island of Hoya, near the town of Tromsø, where she would serve as a semi-fixed artillery battery to deter any Allied amphibious operations against northern Norway. The decision was made to tow her from Fjords to Tromsø, reducing the distance from Scottish air bases significantly. It was, though the Germans could not have fully appreciated this fact at the time, a decision that sealed her fate. The move to Troms reduced the distance from RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland to roughly 2,000 kilometres round, trip still at the very extreme limits of the Lancaster's unmodified range, but within the reach of aircraft that had been stripped of all non-essential equipment, fitted with additional fuel tanks, and loaded to maximum all-up weight. The Tirpitz had been placed within reach of the weapon that was the only thing capable of destroying her. The fjord walls that had protected her at Kofjord did not exist at the Hoya anchorage to the same extent. The new position was more exposed from altitude, and the tall boys were coming back. Chapter 9. Tromsø and the Closing Net. Operations Obviet and Catechism the Tirpitz arrived at her new anchorage near Tromsø on the 15th of October 1944. The move had taken several days and had required considerable preparation. The fjord near the Hoya Island needed to be surveyed for depth, and the hull of the ship, damaged forward by the paravane tallboy hit, had to be monitored carefully throughout the transit to ensure she remained watertight. She was placed in a position where she could be beached in shallow water if she began to flood uncontrollably, a precaution that reflected the realistic assessment her engineers had made of her structural condition. Sandbags and gravel were deposited around the hull to stabilize her on the bottom and prevent her from capsizing if she were further damaged. She was, in other words, being prepared not for offensive deployment, but for the kind of passive defensive role that the German Naval Command had concluded was the only use left for her. It was an honest assessment. It was also a considerable come down for a ship that had been commissioned 3.5 years earlier as the centerpiece of German naval power. The RAF was watching. Norwegian resistance operatives transmitted the Tirpitz's position almost immediately after she anchored. The planning for a follow-up tallboy attack, which had already been designated Operation Obviate, was adjusted to account for the new anchorage. The move to Tromsø had, from the British perspective, simplified one aspect of the problem considerably. There was no longer any need to use Soviet airfields. The round trip from Lossiemouth to Tromsø was within range of Lancasters, fitted with additional fuel tankage. Specifically, the decision was made to install a fuel tank where the Lancaster's mid-upper gun turret normally lived, removing the turret entirely to save weight. This left the aircraft with a reduced defensive armament, a fact that was accepted in the calculation that fighter interception over Tromsø, while possible, was less likely than over Central Europe, and that the FW-190s, based at Norwegian airfields, could be dealt with by the Lancaster's remaining guns, if necessary. Operation Obviate was executed on the 29th of October 1944. 32 Lancasters of 617 Squadron and 609 Squadron took off from Lossiemouth. The weather over Tromsø was poor. Partial cloud cover over the target meant that the bomb aimer's visual acquisition of the Tirpitz was intermittent, and none of the tall boys struck the ship directly, though there were near misses close enough to the hull that the shock waves caused additional flooding and structural stress. The operation was judged a failure, though the near misses confirmed that the approach and attack geometry were sound. The Tirpitz remained afloat. Repairs to the flooding caused by obviate near misses occupied the crew over the following days. The German response to the obviate attack included an urgent request to Luftwaffe Command for more effective fighter cover over the Tromsø anchorage. The response from Luftwaffe Command was not satisfying. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters stationed at Norwegian airfields lacked the range to provide extended cover over Tromsø and the Norwegian air defense network, while functional, was not designed to intercept a large formation of heavy bombers operating at high altitude from very long range. The fundamental problem that the Tirpitz was simply too far away from effective German air defense assets could not be solved by organizational measures alone. It would have required either moving more aircraft to Norway, which was not possible given the demands on the Luftwaffe from the eastern and western fronts, in the autumn of 1944, or moving the Tirpitz back within range of her own fighter cover, which would have placed her beyond the range of the Lancaster-Tallboy combination. The Tirpitz was caught in a geography that could not be resolved in her favour. The final raid, Operation Catechism, was mounted on the 12th of November 1944. 30 Lancasters took off from Lossiemouth. The force was divided between 617 squadron carrying tallboys and a smaller formation carrying conventional bombs as secondary weapons. The weather forecast for the Tromsø area was favourable. Clear skies were predicted, and the forecast proved to be accurate. The Lancasters flew at low level over the North Sea to avoid radar detection for as long as possible, then climbed to bombing altitude as they crossed the Norwegian coast. The first sight of the Tirpitz came as the aircraft cleared the last ridge of high ground before Tromsø. The ship was visible in the grey November water, moored in her sandbank berth, smoke beginning to rise from her funnel as the crew attempted to raise steam and move the ship, and her anti-aircraft guns already beginning to fire. The bomb run began at 0940 in the morning. The Lancasters of 617 Squadron went in first, the bomb aimer in the lead aircraft, holding the bomb sight steady on the unmistakable grey bulk of the Tirpitz below. Released his tallboy at roughly 14,000 feet. The weapon took approximately 35 seconds to fall. A second tallboy followed, and then more, the crews pressing through the anti-aircraft fire with the particular deliberateness that precision bombing at altitude required. The Tirpitz's anti-aircraft gunners were firing continuously. Several Lancasters were hit, but none were brought down. 2 tallboys struck the Tirpitz squarely. A third near miss caused additional severe hull damage. The first hit penetrated the armoured deck and detonated inside the ship. The second hit struck further forward. In the sequence of events that followed, which took roughly 10 minutes from the first hit to the capsizing of the ship, the Tirpitz first listed heavily to port, then rolled with increasing speed until she was lying on her side, then continued past 90 degrees until she came to rest with her keel, with facing the sky at an angle of roughly 135 degrees from upright. She settled on the bottom of the fjord in about 30 meters of water, her hull inverted, only her bottom and a portion of her side visible above the surface. In the chaos of the final minutes, as the ship rolled, many of the crew were trapped in compartments that rapidly flooded. Others managed to reach the outer hull as she capsized and were rescued. Others were trapped between the inverted hull and the seabed in air pockets that rescuers worked through the night to reach, using cutting equipment to breach the hull and pull survivors out. The exact number of men killed has been a matter of some historical uncertainty, but the German naval records indicate that approximately 960 men were lost out of a crew of approximately 1,700 at the time of the sinking. The Norwegian civilian population of Tromsø watched from the shore. The town had not been evacuated. The German authorities had not anticipated that an attack on this scale and accuracy was coming, or had not acted on whatever concerns they had. And residents saw the entire sequence of events from a range close enough that the anti-aircraft fire was visible and the sounds of the explosions were felt physically. It was the largest single warship sinking that Norwegian civilians would ever witness. The smoke column from the burning fuel oil rose above the Tromsø fjord for hours afterward. The lonely Queen of the North had come to rest at last. She was lying on the bottom, 600 kilometers inside the Arctic Circle, on the 12th of November, 1944, 3 years, 8 months, and 18 days after her commissioning. Chapter 10. The Men Inside. Life Aboard the Tirpitz. The strategic story of the Tirpitz is a story of immense forces, naval policy, aerial technology, intelligence systems, political decisions at the highest level of two warring states. But inside that story, there is another one, quieter and considerably more human. The story of what it was actually like to live inside the machine. Over 2,000 men served aboard the Tirpitz at any given time during her Norwegian years. Most of them were young, teenagers and men in their early 20s, drawn from across Germany by the conscription system that had swelled the Kriegsmarine from a skeleton force in 1935 to a full wartime navy by 1940. Their experience of the war was unlike almost any other in the German military, and it deserves a careful accounting. The physical environment of the ship was, by any contemporary naval standard, reasonably well appointed. The Kriegsmarine of the 1930s and 40s had inherited from the Imperial German Navy a strong tradition of attention to crew welfare in capital ship design, and the Tirpitz reflected this. The mess areas were more spacious than on many contemporaries. The ventilation system was designed for Arctic, as well as temperate service, and the medical facilities included a proper sick bay with surgical capacity. But 2,500 men, sharing approximately 51,000 tons of steel, generate a particular social ecology that no amount of careful design can entirely smooth out. The hierarchies were rigid and formal. The gulf between officers and enlisted men was not merely social convention, but was structured into the physical layout of the ship, with different messing areas, different recreational spaces, and different access to the upper decks. A bootsmat, a petty officer, and a Lieutenant zur See inhabited what were, in practical terms, different ships. The rhythm of daily life was governed by the watch system. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, rotating through the day and night without reference to daylight, which in any case was often absent in the Norwegian winter. For the anti-aircraft gun crews, who maintained continuous air defense, watches regardless of threat assessment, the monotony of staring at an empty sky from an open mountain, temperatures that could reach -20 degrees Celsius, was a physical ordeal that, no amount of training had fully prepared them for. The Arctic winter at the latitude of Fjord meant that daylight, at the darkest point of the year, amounted to only a few hours of grey twilight. The Arctic summer brought the opposite problem. Continuous daylight made sleep difficult and reduced the natural camouflage that darkness provided against air attack. Neither extreme was comfortable. Both were relentless. Shore leave was limited and carefully managed. The Norwegian population in the areas surrounding the Tirpitz's various anchorages was, to put it mildly, not enthusiastic about the presence of the German occupiers. Fraternization was discouraged on both sides by German authorities who were concerned about security leaks, and by the Norwegian civilian population who had their own reasons for avoiding close contact with the occupying forces. The sailors who went ashore at Trondheim found a city that was functional but cold in every sense of the word. Shops were open, cafes operated under occupation regulations, and the formal apparatus of civilian life continued. But the occupation was visible in every interaction. In the requisitioned buildings, flying swastika flags, in the ration queues, in the careful expressions of people who had learned that the wrong word in the wrong company had consequences. The crew developed, as crews confined to a single vessel for long periods invariably do, an intense internal social world. Sports competitions between divisions were organized with the serious that men of limited external stimulation bring to whatever internal competition is available. The ship's newspaper, printed on the vessel's own press, covered these events with a thoroughness that suggests they mattered considerably to the participants. Music was organized. There were a number of musicians among the crew, and informal performances were part of the social life of the mess decks in a Dijksrums way that the official accounts from the period reflect. The library carried technical publications and fiction in roughly equal measure. Educational courses were offered, because Captain Top and his successors understood that a crew kept intellectually occupied was a crew that maintained its discipline and morale through the long periods of inactivity that the strategic situation imposed. The fundamental psychological challenge for the crew was not the physical hardship, the cold, the confinement, the limited shore leave. It was the purposelessness. These were men who had trained for war, had been assigned to one of the most powerful weapons their country had ever built, and had then been required to sit in a fjord and wait. The ship's official position was that the waiting was itself a service, that the threat the Tirpitz represented was holding down British forces that would otherwise be deployed elsewhere, and that this function was strategically valuable. For the officers who had the intellectual framework to understand the fleet in being concept, this argument was coherent even if it was not entirely satisfying. For the able seaman manning an anti-aircraft gun mount in the dark at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in January, staring at empty sky above a fjord he had been staring at for 18 months, the concept of fleet in being offered rather less comfort. The air raid experiences of the crew, particularly Operation Tungsten in April 1944, when 14 bombs struck the ship, tested both the material and human resilience of the vessel and its people. The 122 men killed in that attack were the ship's heaviest single-action casualties, and the care with which the dead were buried ashore, the services conducted, and the records maintained reflects both the formal German military procedures for handling mass casualties and the particular grief of a close community that had been together for 3 years. The wounded, 316 of them, were treated in the ship's sick bay and at shore medical facilities, and their recovery conducted in the shadow of repeated subsequent attacks, was complicated by the constant state of readiness that the crew was required to maintain. There was no respite period after Tungsten. The smoke had barely cleared before the next air raid warning exercise was scheduled. The final weeks aboard the Tirpitz, as she lay at Tromsø in the autumn of 1944, were a period of particular difficulty. The Paravane tallboy hit in September had taken a significant human toll, lives lost in the initial detonation, and considerable distress caused by the flooding and structural damage that affected the forward parts of the ship. The crew knew, in the way that experienced sailors always know the condition of their vessel, that the Tirpitz was no longer the ship she had been. The forward section was flooded and compartmented. The ship sat lower in the water than she should. The repair work was extensive but visible in its limitations, and the Luftwaffe's inability to provide adequate fighter cover, which was common knowledge among the senior ratings, even if it was not officially discussed, told men who could read tactical situations that the next RAF attack, if and when it came, would face less opposition than the earlier ones. They continued to maintain their watches, to drill, to go through the motions of a fighting ship. On the morning of the 12th of November, the duty watch reported to their stations, as they had on every morning of the previous 3 years. The sky over Tromsø was clear and cold. Chapter 11, The Norwegian Dimension, Occupation, Resistance, and the Fjords account of the Tirpitz that treats the Norwegian setting as merely backdrop, a photogenic collection of cliffs and dark water surrounding the real story, misses something important. The presence of the Tirpitz in Norway was not a neutral geographic fact. It was an aspect of the German occupation of a sovereign country and its effects on that country, on the people who lived in the fjord communities around the various anchorages, on the resistance operatives who observed and reported on the ship's movements at considerable personal risk, and on the long-term relationship between Norway and the memory of the war, deserve a chapter of their own. Germany occupied Norway following the invasion of April and May 1940. The occupation was administered through a combination of a German military governor, the Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, and a collaborationist Norwegian government, nominally led by Vidkun Quisling, whose name has since become a common noun in several languages, a measure of how thoroughly his collaborations was judged by his contemporaries and by history. The occupation was not uniformly brutal by the standards of German conduct in Eastern Europe, but it was an occupation nonetheless, involving requisition of property and food, forced labor, restrictions on movement, censorship, and the ever-present threat of arrest and deportation for those suspected of resistance activity. Norway's Jewish community, numbering perhaps 770 in the country at the time of the occupation, was subject to the same racial policies applied across occupied Europe with devastating results. The fjord communities near the Tirpitz's various anchorages experienced the occupation in specific and local ways. At Fettenfjord, near Trondheim, German engineering teams requisitioned land and labour to construct the shore-based defences and support facilities that the anchorage required. Norwegian civilians who had lived and farmed in the area found themselves in uncomfortable proximity to one of the most heavily defended military installations in occupied Europe. The German forces did not simply build their installations and leave the local population alone. The requirements of operational security meant that movement in the areas near the anchorage was restricted, that Norwegian fishing boats were limited in their activities, and that the community's normal patterns of life were disrupted in ways that ranged from inconvenient to genuinely harmful. The Norwegian resistance operated in this environment with a combination of courage, ingenuity, and careful organizational discipline that the post-war historiography has increasingly recognized as representing one of the more effective intelligence networks in occupied Europe. The XU network, the primary Norwegian civilian intelligence organization, working with the British Special Operations Executive and the British Admiralty, had agents operating in the communities near all three of the Tirpitz's main anchorages, Fettenfjord, Bogenfjord near Narvik, and Kofjord in Altafjord. The reports these agents transmitted covered the ship's exact position, movements, the disposition of the anti-aircraft defenses, the layout of the torpedo nets, changes in the defensive arrangements, and indications of any planned sailing. This intelligence was not gathered without cost. Norwegian civilians who provided accommodation, transport, or any form of assistance to resistance operatives faced severe penalties if discovered. Penalties that included arrest, deportation to concentration camps in Germany, and execution. The relationship between the Tirpitz and the landscape it occupied was also physical in a more direct sense. The camouflage measures that German engineers implemented at each anchorage involved the large-scale cutting of trees and the construction of artificial structures on the surrounding hillsides to break up the ship's silhouette from aerial observation. At Kofjord, which lies in a landscape of particular alpine beauty, steep mountainsides rising directly from the water, bare rock above the tree line, and in summer a brief flowering of the alpine vegetation. The German modifications to the shoreline were extensive. Anti-aircraft batteries were cut into the hillsides. Accommodation and supply facilities were constructed in the woods above the water. Roads were built or improved to bring supplies to these installations. The physical marks of these works remained visible in the Norwegian landscape for decades after the war. Concrete foundations, excavated positions, cleared areas on hillsides that had been bare since the German engineers stripped the cover for the Tirpitz's camouflage program. The question of how Norwegian civilians felt about the various British attempts to destroy the Tirpitz is one that the historical record addresses only imperfectly. The rational calculation was clear enough. Destroying the ship was an Allied strategic objective that served Norway's interests by weakening the German occupation. But the raids that failed, particularly the RF Bomber Command attacks on Fettenfjord in 1942, which involved hundreds of large bombs being dropped in the general area of the fjord without hitting the Tirpitz, caused damage to Norwegian civilian property and in some cases injured Norwegian civilians. The distinction between attacking an enemy warship and bombing a Norwegian fjord was not always as sharp in practice as it was in theory. At Tromsø, where the Tirpitz was finally sunk in November 1944, the proximity of the anchorage to a substantial civilian population created conditions that were, from a humanitarian perspective, quite alarming. The town of Tromsø had a peacetime population of roughly 10,000 people. The arrival of the Tirpitz and the attendant German defense preparations had brought additional military personnel to the area. The RAF's Operation Catechism, which was ultimately successful, involved 30 Lancaster bombers dropping 29 tallboy bombs, each of 5,000 pounds, plus additional conventional ordnance in the vicinity of a populated area. That none of the tallboys struck the town itself was a function of the precise accuracy that 617 Squadron had developed, and of the favourable weather conditions on the 12th of November. It was not guaranteed in advance. The Norwegian resistance operatives who had watched the ship burn and capsize from the Tromsø shoreline, had spent 4 years living with the knowledge that the war being fought around them and ultimately over them could at any moment become immediately and personally catastrophic. The scuttling and salvage operations that followed the sinking of the Tirpitz, conducted by a Norwegian-German consortium, and generating considerable local economic activity in the post-war years, completed the physical transformation of the site from a military installation to a monument and eventually to a tourist destination. The museum that was eventually established aboard a section of the Tirpitz's hull near Tromsø stands today as one of the more visited Second World War sites in Norway for the communities whose wartime experience was shaped so directly by the ship's presence. The memorial function of that museum is not abstract. The name Tirpitz in the Norwegian context carries associations that are distinct from its meaning in the British and German historiographies. It means, among other things, 4 years of occupation, 4 years of risk, and 4 years of waiting for the war to move on and leave the fjords in peace. Chapter 12. The Architects of Destruction, Barnes Wallis, the Lancaster, and the Science of Sinking Giants. There is a line of technological development that runs from a drawing board in a British aircraft factory in the late 1930s to the bottom of the Tromsø Fjord in November 1944, and it is worth tracing that line carefully. Not only because it explains why the Tirpitz was finally sunk when she was, rather than earlier or later, but because it illuminates something larger about the relationship between engineering, science, and the conduct of modern warfare. The story of the Tirpitz's destruction is, in a significant part, a story about a single man's persistent application of physics to problems that military institutions were inclined to solve by the more conventional method of doing the same thing harder. Barnes Neville Wallis was born in 1887, which made him 56 years old, in the year the tall boy entered operational service. He had trained as a marine engineer, shifted to airship design at the beginning of his career, and had worked on the R-100 airship before moving to fixed-wing aircraft design at Vickers in the 1930s. His background gave him an unusual technical perspective. Airship design demanded an understanding of structural loads, materials science, and weight distribution that was, in some respects, more rigorous than the discipline common in aircraft design at that period, where empirical testing rather than theoretical calculation was still the dominant methodology. When Wallis began working on the problems of defeating heavily protected targets, dams, reinforced pens, armored warships, he brought to the analysis a level of theoretical grounding that was genuinely unusual. The key insight behind the tall boy was the concept of terminal velocity and the mechanics of penetration. A conventional bomb released from a medium altitude reached a speed at impact determined by its aerodynamic drag characteristics, typically a few 100 meters per second. This was insufficient to penetrate the multiple layers of armor and hardened concrete that the most important German targets were protected by. Wallis's calculation, which drew on ballistic tables, material science data, and his own analysis of soil and structural mechanics, showed that a bomb of sufficient weight, shaped for minimum aerodynamic drag, and falling from a very high altitude, could reach speeds close to the speed of sound, and thereby achieve a penetrating power that was orders of magnitude greater than conventional ordnance. The design that resulted, the long, slender tall boy, was not aesthetically conventional. Its length to diameter ratio was unusual, and its spin-stabilizing tail fins were machined to tolerances that munitions manufacturers found challenging to maintain consistently. But when it worked as designed, its behavior in the terminal phase of its fall was unlike anything previously available to bomber forces. The Lancaster that delivered the tallboys to the Tirpitz was itself a product of a specific sequence of technical developments. The aircraft had originated as a modification of the twin-engine Avro Manchester, a bomber that had been plagued by engine reliability problems. Roy Chadwick's design team at Avro had essentially rebuilt the Manchester with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, creating an aircraft that combined substantial payload capacity with reasonable performance at altitude and impressive range. By the autumn of 1944, the Lancaster Mk3s in service with 617 Squadron had been further optimized for the tallboy mission, the bomb bay doors replaced, the mid-upper turret removed, and auxiliary fuel cells installed in the fuselage. The resulting aircraft was not ideal by any operational standard. The removal of the mid-upper turret reduced defensive capability, and the additional fuel tanks created fire risk in the event of battle damage. But it was capable of reaching the Tirpitz at Tromsø with a tallboy and returning to Scotland, which was the precise capability that the mission required. The crews of 617 Squadron, who flew the Catechism mission on the 12th of November, 1944, had been briefed the previous night at Lossiemouth. The weather forecasts were favourable. The intelligence on the Tirpitz's exact position in the Tromsø anchorage was current and detailed. The German fighter response was assessed as likely to be limited. The WW190s at the nearest Norwegian airfield had a maximum radius of action that placed the Tirpitz-Tromsø anchorage at the very edge of their effective range, and the German fuel situation in the autumn of 1944 was not one that permitted generous allocations for intercept missions. The assessment proved to be accurate. No German fighter opposition appeared over the target area during the attack. The Lancasters were not unmolested. The Tirpitz's own anti-aircraft fire was maintained throughout the approach and bomb run, but this was manageable at the altitude from which the tallboys were being released. The accuracy achieved by 617 Squadron during Operation Catechism, 2 direct hits, and at least 1 near miss of sufficient proximity to cause significant structural damage, was not accidental. It was the product of a training program that had developed precision bombing methodology in ways that differed substantially from the area bombing doctrine that governed most of Bomber Command's operations. The squadron used the stabilized automatic bomb sight, which allowed the bomb aimer to hold a steady visual fix on the target, while the aircraft flew a constant heading, constant altitude approach, computing a continuous solution to the ballistic problem of delivering the bomb within acceptable distance of the aim point. The bomb aimer's skill lay in the acquisition and maintenance of the aim point, through the considerable distraction of being at the apex of a formation that was generating a large and visible radar return, while flying predictably toward a target that was shooting back. The men who held their bomb sights steady on the grey hull of the Tirpitz through those minutes deserved their place in the technical history of precision weapons delivery. The 2 tallboys that struck the Tirpitz on the 12th of November detonated inside the ship's hull, not on the armoured deck, not on the belt armour, but inside the spaces protected by that armour, because the bombs had penetrated before detonating. This is the critical distinction between the tallboy and every other weapon that had been used against the Tirpitz. The conventional bombs dropped in the 1942 raids, and the Barracuda bombs from Operation Tungsten had detonated on or near the outer surface of the ship, transmitting their energy into the armor rather than through it. The tall boy detonated inside. The energy had nowhere to go except outward through the ship's internal structure. The results? Flooding, structural failure, the catastrophic capsizing that followed within minutes were the inevitable consequence of releasing that energy in a confined space surrounded by steel. Barnes Wallis, receiving the news of the Tirpitz's sinking at his office in Weybridge on the 12th of November, is reported to have been quietly satisfied, not triumphant, but confirmed in a calculation he had been working on for several years. The tall boy had by that point already been used successfully against a range of hardened targets across occupied Europe. The Tirpitz was arguably its most consequential single target. But from a purely technical standpoint, she was not the most difficult. The Ruhr dams and the reinforced U-boat pens had required more inventive solutions. What the Tirpitz represented, in Wallis's technical accounting, was the validation of a principle: that the way to defeat armor was not to build bombs heavy enough to survive the impact with armor intact, but to build bombs fast enough to pass through armor before it mattered. The physics had been correct. The engineering had been sufficient. The weapon had worked. The last entry in the Tirpitz's operational record, as preserved in the German Naval Archives, is a damage assessment report dated the 12th of November, 1944. Never completed. The officer who began filling it in presumably stopped when the deck beneath his feet began to tilt, and the report was found among the recovered papers from the wreck in the post-war salvage operation. It is not a dramatic document. It is a bureaucratic form, partly filled in, cut off mid-sentence. The ship it was meant to describe was already on her side, listing toward the bottom of the fjord, and the men who had served on that ship were, in those final minutes, doing the only thing left that could be done. They were trying to get out. Chapter 13. The Final Minutes. What actually happened on the 12th of November? The official German report on the sinking of the Tirpitz, compiled in late November of 1944 by the senior naval command in Norway, is a document that reads with the particular flatness of an institutional account produced in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. Precise where precision was still possible, cautious where it was not, and haunted throughout by the gap between what was planned and what actually occurred. The United States Naval Technical Mission in Europe subsequently obtained this report after the German surrender, translated it, and forwarded it under their own analysis to the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington in August of 1945. This combined document, the German operational record annotated by American naval engineering experts, is one of the most granular accounts of a capital ship's final minutes that exists from the Second World War. And it deserves a chapter of careful attention because the Tirpitz did not simply sink. She capsized in a specific sequence of mechanical and human failures that would have been entirely preventable had any one of several decisions been made differently. The morning of the 12th of November began ordinarily. The Tirpitz was lying at anchor off the island of Hokoya in the Tromsø fjord, with stern and bow anchors deployed to prevent her from swinging into positions that would expose her flanks to the direction most likely to be attacked from. The fuel situation was poor. The ship had approximately 3,000 tons of fuel and fresh water aboard, against a full load figure of roughly 10,000 tons. This deficit of 7,000 tons from full load was not merely a logistical inconvenience. As the American analysts subsequently pointed out with considerable clarity, those 7,000 tons of fuel stored in tanks low in the ship served a structural purpose. They acted as ballast, lowering the center of gravity and improving the vessel's transverse stability. Without them, the Tirpitz was miserably less resistant to capsizing than her designers had calculated. The fact that the empty fuel tanks had not been ballasted with seawater to compensate for this deficit was a decision that, in the event, contributed directly to the speed of her capsize. Whether it was an oversight, an accepted operational risk, or simply an item that had not been prioritized in the turbulent weeks following the move from Fjord, is not entirely clear from the surviving records. An air raid watch had been stationed at daybreak, which was consistent with standing procedures. The first warning arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. A report of single aircraft near the town of Bodo, roughly 500 kilometers to the south. The Tirpitz was connected immediately to the main air raid warning station at Tromsø. At 8:15, a further warning arrived, stating that 3 Lancasters had been sighted, flying east at 7:37, with more coming in on a northeasterly course. The commanding officer, Captain Robert Weber, who had taken command only 8 days earlier, when his predecessor, Captain Wolfjung, departed, requested fighter cover through the naval communications chain. No acknowledgement came back. This failure in communications was not a technical malfunction in any simple sense. It was the product of the rigid separation of naval and Luftwaffe communications channels. Naval personnel could not pass information directly to their Luftwaffe equivalents. Every message had to travel up through the naval chain, across to a shared level, and back down through the Luftwaffe chain. In the 23 minutes between the 8:15 warning and the sounding of the ship's air raid alarm, this system failed to deliver an intercept order to the fighter unit at Bardufoss in time for it to make any difference. The air raid alarm was sounded at 8:54. The crew went to battle stations with the efficiency of people who had drilled the procedure thousands of times over 3 years. At 9:15, a formation of roughly 20 aircraft was sighted at a range of approximately 120 kilometers, approaching on a course that headed directly toward the Tirpitz. A second formation was sighted shortly afterward. The altitude of both formations was between approximately 4,000 and 5,000 meters. At 9:20, Captain Weber repeated the request for fighter cover and was told the fighters had taken off. They had, in fact, taken off several minutes too late. The bombers would reach the target before the fighters could close the range. At 9:27, the first Lancaster formation split into groups of 4 or 5 aircraft and began its attack run. In contrast to previous attack patterns, the approach was made athwart ships, crossing over the Tirpitz at right angles to her length, rather than attacking from ahead or astern. This choice of axis was deliberate. It maximized the target area presented to the bomb aimers and minimized the time the aircraft spent in the lethal zone of the ship's anti-aircraft batteries. Heavy anti-aircraft guns opened fire at 9:34 from a range of roughly 12 kilometers. The formation broke up slightly and then reassembled. Medium anti-aircraft and machine guns opened fire at 9:36. At 9:38, exactly 4 minutes after the heavy guns began firing, and less than 60 seconds after the medium guns joined in, 29 tallboy bombs were released in a single concentrated pattern. Wing Commander James Tate, commanding number 617 Squadron, had spotted the Tirpitz from 32 kilometers away in the clear November air, and later recalled she looked like a spider in her web against the glittering blue and green waters of the fjord. His aircraft was the first to release. The bomb fell for roughly 35 seconds and struck the port side of the ship amidships. near the aircraft catapult track. It penetrated the armored deck and detonated in a wing fuel tank outboard of the port engine room. A second confirmed hit struck near turret Bruno in the forward section of the ship, apparently without detonating. A third impact, classified as probable in the subsequent analysis, struck abaft and to port of turret Caesar. Large quantities of water swept into the Tirpitz immediately. She began to list to port. Captain Weber ordered counter-flooding, the standard emergency procedure of deliberately flooding tanks on the opposite side of a listing ship to restore upright trim. The order was given. It was not carried out. It was discovered afterward that the counter-flooding control stations had been, abandoned, whether because the men stationed there had been killed or wounded by the initial bomb detonations, or because they had left their posts as the list rapidly increased, or because communications had been severed, has never been entirely resolved. The American analysts note a further complication. The counter-flooding system on the Tirpitz may not have been capable of moving water quickly, enough to counteract a list developing at the speed observed. The port counter-flooding tanks, designed to be flooded from the sea, were on the outer side of the wing liquid storage tanks. When those external tanks were ruptured by the bomb hits, the flooding moment they generated was applied at a point further from the ship's centerline than the designers had intended. When calculating the system's capability, the geometry was wrong, and the physics of capsizing did not wait for the geometry to be corrected. At 9:45, with the list at between 30 and 40 degrees, Captain Weber ordered the lower decks evacuated. This was the third critical decision of the morning, and the American post-war analysts identify it as the one that made capsizing inevitable. As the crew opened hatches and companionways to evacuate, the watertight integrity of the lower portion of the ship, already compromised by the bomb, hits, and the flooding, was broken entirely. Water moved freely through spaces that had been individually sealed against flooding. The report notes with a certain technical neutrality that perhaps 17,000 tons of seawater were present in the Tirpitz at this stage. The physics of that situation, 17,000 tons of water on the port side of a ship designed to carry 42,000 tons in equilibrium, was not recoverable by any measure available to the crew in the minutes remaining. At 9:45, with the ship lying at 60 degrees, turret Caesar exploded. The entire rotating structure of the turret, roughly 1,000 tons of steel, including the guns, the gun house, and the associated mechanism, was hurled approximately 25 yards through the air and landed in the water beside the capsizing ship. The cause of the explosion is not definitively established in either the German reports or the subsequent American analysis. The most probable explanation is a fire in the magazine associated with turret Caesar, possibly started by a bomb detonation nearby, or by electrical short circuits caused by the shock of the earlier hits. Chief Engineer Eichler, interviewed after the war, advanced an alternative theory involving the unusual stowage of powder charges. Some bags stowed transversely against regulations, which he believed had been ignited by a non-contact detonation acting through the hull. The analysts found this explanation less convincing than the fire hypothesis, but acknowledged that the evidence was insufficient to close the question. What is beyond dispute is the effect. The explosion of the turret pushed the already critically inclined ship past the point of no return. She capsized at 9:52, 14 minutes after the first bombs landed. She came to rest on the floor of the anchorage with the hull upside down, lying at approximately 135 degrees from upright. her superstructure embedded in the seabed mud, her flat bottom and bilge keel facing the grey November sky. The water was approximately 30 meters deep. The ship's electrical supply remained operative until the very last moment. The turbo generator in one of the surviving engine rooms was still running as the hull inverted, and lights were burning in some compartments as the water closed over the men inside them. The German report notes, with something that reads across 70 years, as admiration and grief in equal measure, that there was no panic. The crew conducted themselves with complete discipline throughout the attack and the capsizing. The commanding officer was among the dead. His senior officers were among the dead. The vast majority of the approximately 1,700 men who had been aboard that morning were now either in the water, on the overturned hull, or sealed inside it. The rescue operation began within minutes. German sailors climbed onto the exposed hull and listened for tapping from inside. Men who had survived the capsizing by finding air pockets in compartments that were now inverted but still retained trapped air. Acetylene-cutting torches were needed to breach the hull plating, and almost none were initially available. Norwegian civilian torch owners, we are told in the Norwegian accounts, hid their equipment in the first hours, a detail that requires no particular elaboration to understand in the context of 4 years of occupation. Eventually, torches were gathered from the surrounding town and military facilities. Within 24 hours, 87 men had been cut free from inside the inverted hull. Cutting continued for 2 further days before it was assessed that the air supply inside the wreck would have been exhausted. The total number of men rescued from within the hull was approximately 87. The total number of dead, killed outright, drowned in the capsizing, or trapped inside, lies between 940 and 1,204, depending on which accounting is accepted. The range reflects the difficulty of establishing exactly how many men had been aboard that specific morning, given the movement of personnel in the days before the attack. Chapter 14. The Court-Martial and the Reckoning. Germany's internal accounting. The destruction of the Tirpitz generated, within weeks, a German military legal process that tells us a great deal about how the Third handled institutional failure in the closing phase of a war it was losing. The court-martial proceedings that followed were not conducted in any spirit of detached professional inquiry. They were conducted in an atmosphere of political pressure, institutional defensiveness, and the particular anxiety of a military establishment that needed to explain a catastrophe to a leader who had already expressed, repeatedly and violently, his dissatisfaction with his navy and his air force. The proceedings are historically interesting, both for what they found and for what they chose not to examine. The officer who became the primary target of the proceedings was Major Heinrich Ehrler, the senior Luftwaffe pilot at Bardufoss, the airfield nearest Tromsø, who had command over the 38 fighter aircraft that should have been available to defend the Tirpitz on the morning of the 12th of November. Ehrler was a genuine ace. He had accumulated well over 200 aerial victories on the Eastern Front and was one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. He had arrived at Bardufoss only days before the attack, in the process of moving his unit from Kirkenes in the far northeast as Soviet forces advanced. His unit was disorganized, inadequately briefed on its defensive responsibilities, and largely composed of inexperienced pilots who had been hastily assembled in the Norwegian redeployment. None of this was Ehrler's fault in any simple sense. The strategic situation that had placed his disorganized unit in northern Norway with unclear tasking and poor communications, was the product of decisions made far above his rank. But in the event, the fighters from Bardufoss failed to intercept the Lancasters. Only Erla himself reached the Tromsø area, alone, and arrived after the Tirpitz had already capsized. The others appear to have scattered in various directions, with different reports, giving different destinations for different pilots. Erla was court-martialed and convicted on a charge of leaving his operations room under the command of a non-commissioned officer on the morning of the attack, a technical dereliction of duty charge that served as a proxy for the broader failure to protect the Tirpitz. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, but was released after 1 month and demoted. He was subsequently returned to combat flying in what reads in retrospect as an acknowledgement that the sentence had been essentially political rather than genuinely punitive, and was killed in action on the 4th of April, 1945, barely 5 months after the events for which he had been convicted. Numerous commentators, both contemporary and subsequent, have concluded that Erla was scapegoated, that the genuine failures of communication between Naval and Luftwaffe Command, the inadequate fighter force available in northern Norway, and the operational mismanagement of the final weeks of the Tirpitz's existence were institutional problems that could not be resolved by punishing a single officer who had, by most accounts, done what he could with what he had. Several other personnel were also court-martialed in connection with the attack. Officers commanding observation posts, anti-aircraft positions, and auxiliary vessels, on the grounds that warnings had not been passed efficiently enough. The German naval inquiry into the capsizing, ordered by Grand Admiral Dönitz, reached a conclusion that fixed the technical blame squarely on the decision to moor the Tirpitz at Hokoya, specifically the finding that the actual depth of water at the prepared berth had not conformed to the requirements and directions of the commander-in-chief. The anchorage had been selected because the water was believed to be shallow enough to prevent the ship from sinking completely if attacked, and from a shallower berth, her guns could still control the approaches to Tromsø. The depth had been underestimated. The dredging operation, begun in early November to reduce the water depth further, was only half complete when the attack came. This finding, that a fundamental logistical miscalculation had contributed to a loss that might have been mitigated, was not politically welcome, but it was accurate, and it stood in the official record. The court-martial proceedings did not address 2 questions that, from a historical perspective, were more significant than any of the ones formally adjudicated. The first was whether the decision to move the Tirpitz to Tromsø, rather than either returning her to Germany for proper repairs or decommissioning her in place, had been operationally defensible. The answer, seen clearly from outside the pressures of the moment, was probably no. The move brought her within range of tallboy-equipped Lancasters flying from Scotland without fighter escort in exchange for a notional role as a floating battery that she was too badly damaged to perform effectively. The second question was whether the decision to keep the Tirpitz in Norway through the summer and autumn of 1944, as the evidence accumulated that she could not be repaired, and that the tallboy posed a threat she could not survive, had served any purpose commensurate with the cost. These were questions that the German military's institutional culture in November of 1944 was not equipped to ask of itself. They were left for later. Dönitz, who had replaced Raeder as head of the Kriegsmarine, in January of 1943, absorbed the loss of the Tirpitz with the resigned pragmatism that characterized his leadership in the final phase of the war. Unlike Hitler's volcanic reaction to earlier naval failures, Donitz's response to the Tromsø sinking was measured, partly because the ship had effectively already been written off as a fighting unit, partly because the outcome was not entirely unexpected, and partly because Dönitz was a submarine officer at heart who had never entirely reconciled himself to the strategic rationale for maintaining expensive surface ships in Norwegian fjords. The Tirpitz was gone. The home fleet of the Royal Navy, which had been held in check for 3 years by her existence, was now free to be deployed elsewhere. Half of its capital ship strength was dispatched to other theatres within weeks, principally to the Pacific, where the war against Japan was entering its final grinding phase. The strategic release created by the Tirpitz's destruction was real and immediate. Whether it was worth the cost of the campaign to achieve it is a question with no clean answer. The German military's internal reckoning with the Tirpitz was, in one sense, never complete. The officers most responsible for the strategic decisions that kept the ship in Norway through 1943 and 1944, decisions made at Hitler's explicit direction in some cases, and at Donitz's professional judgment in others, were never called to account in the same focused way that Erler and the Observer post commanders were. The law of institutions in wartime is that individual officers at the operational level bear the weight of systemic failures that were generated far above them. Erler served 1 month of a 3-year sentence and returned to combat. The men who made the decisions that placed an irreplaceable ship in an undefended anchorage within range of an unstoppable weapon were still giving orders as the war continued around them. The 900-odd men sealed inside the inverted hull off Hokoya Island had no reckoning of any kind, only the cold water, the shrinking air, and the sound of cutting torches working from outside. The Luftwaffe court-martial of Erler concluded in December 1944. By that point, the rescue operation at Tromsø had been complete for several weeks. The survivors had been distributed to other postings. The hull of the Tirpitz lay in the fjord, its bottom visible above the waterline at low tide. Winter had settled over northern Norway. The German occupation, which had 5 more months to run before the armistice, continued, and the men who had served on the Tirpitz, those who had survived, carried the ship with them into the rest of their lives, which is, in the end, what all wartime service becomes eventually. Not a chapter of history, but a weight carried forward. Chapter 15, Salvage, Cutting Apart the Giant, 1948 to 1957. There is a particular kind of melancholy that attaches to warship salvage. It is different from the melancholy of the sinking itself. More patient, more economic, and in some ways more final. When a warship is destroyed in battle, it is at least destroyed in the context of the purpose it was built for. When it is subsequently cut apart by salvage workers with torches and sold as scrap, it is reduced to something more basic. Tons of steel and non-ferrous metal with a market value calculated by a company accountant in an office somewhere far from the fjord. The Tirpitz underwent both of these endings, separated by 4 years. And the second has received considerably less attention from historians than the first, which is perhaps understandable, but leaves the story incomplete. The German Navy, in the immediate aftermath of the sinking, acted with the practical efficiency that characterized the Kriegsmarine, even in its dying weeks. Before rescue operations were complete, German salvage personnel removed the ship's 3 bronze propellers, each weighing many tons, and had them transported to Germany for the non-ferrous metal they contained. Several other components of easily accessible material value were similarly stripped during the winter of 1944 to 45. These initial German salvage efforts were halted by the German surrender in May of 1945, and the wreck then became the property, in the complex legal sense that wartime prizes become properties, of whoever could claim jurisdiction over it. Norway, which had been occupied by Germany for 5 years, had certain obvious claims. The Allied powers had others. The eventual resolution was that the Norwegian government assumed ownership of the wreck as part of the broader settlement of German occupation assets. In 1948, the Norwegian government sold the salvage rights to a company called Skips Opphogeri, a Norwegian ship breaking firm, which subsequently entered into partnership with the German firm Eisen und Metall of Hamburg to carry out the actual work. This arrangement, a Norwegian company and a German one, cooperating to dismantle a German warship sunk in Norwegian waters during a German occupation of Norway, has a certain compressed historical irony that the businessmen involved apparently navigated without difficulty. The steel was valuable. The Tirpitz contained tens of thousands of tons of it, much of it of very high quality by 1940s standards. The armor plate in particular, case-hardened and face-hardened in ways that required considerable metallurgical skill, was a genuinely premium material. The salvage work was conducted in situ. The wreck was not razed in its entirety, but was instead cut apart at the site and removed in sections. This was partly because raising the entire hull would have been enormously expensive and technically challenging, and partly because the armored belt plate was so thick and so heavy that even sectional removal required substantial equipment. A salvage wharf was constructed on the shore of Hokoya Island to support the operation. Cutting equipment, including the acetylene torches that had earlier been used to rescue survivors from inside the inverted hull, was used on an industrial scale to section the hull plating and armor. The work proceeded through Norwegian summers and was paused or reduced during the worst of the winter months. It was, by any measure, a physically demanding and somewhat dangerous operation. The wreck was partially submerged, unstable in places, and contained unexploded ordnance, whose location was not always known. The most valuable material in the wreck, from the perspective of post-war industrial demand, was the armor plate. Some of it was purchased by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration, which used sections of Tirpitz armor plating to cover excavations in roads in the Oslo region, a use that continued for decades, and which means that sections of the heaviest battleship armor ever installed on a European warship ended their existence, protecting Norwegian roads from falling debris. Other armor plate and hull steel was sold to industrial buyers in Norway and Germany and melted down for general steel production. The wreck also contained substantial quantities of teak deck planking, which was removed during the salvage operation and reportedly found use as fencing timber near the wreck site itself, which, if true, is one of the more pathetic fates for a component of a vessel that had been the centerpiece of German naval power. There is a more significant dimension to the salvaged steel that has been recognized more fully in recent decades. Steel manufactured before the atmospheric nuclear tests of the 1950s, the test series that began in earnest in 1945, and continued through the 1950s and into the 1960s, has a measurable property that modern steel does not. It is free of the low-level radioactive contamination that nuclear atmospheric testing introduced into the global atmosphere, and which was subsequently incorporated into all steel manufactured using air in the smelting process. This pre-nuclear steel sometimes called low background steel, is genuinely valuable for applications requiring very sensitive radiation detection equipment, such as medical imaging devices and scientific instruments, because the background radiation of the equipment's own materials must be minimized to detect small signals accurately. Steel from the Tirpitz and from other pre-1945 warships salvaged from the sea has been used in such applications. Parts of a ship that set out to be the centerpiece of German naval power ended up as components in instruments designed to detect cancer in human bodies. The gap between those two purposes is large enough to be considered without any additional commentary. The salvage operation was not without its environmental costs, which have become apparent only in recent decades. Contemporary environmental protection standards were not applied. The 1990s, 40s, and 1950s operated under no equivalent framework, and materials that were not worth salvaging were simply dumped on the seabed around the wreck site. These include hydrocarbons from the fuel that remained in some of the ship's tanks, PCB-containing materials from electrical installations, heavy metals from paint systems and structural components, and various other substances that modern environmental assessment would treat as serious contaminants. A research project published in the Journal of Ocean Technology in 2024, using remotely operated underwater vehicles and acoustic mapping equipment, has produced the first comprehensive map of the salvage site and estimated the volume of remaining debris at approximately 750 cubic meters, with a total mass of over 2,500 tons. The contamination of the seabed sediments is measurable and ongoing. The Tirpitz is still, in a very precise chemical sense, present in the fjord where she sank. Salvage work concluded in approximately 1957. By that point, the majority of the hull material had been removed, though significant sections, particularly those deepest in the seabed and most difficult to access, remained and remain today embedded in the sediment below the anchorage. The site off Hokoya Island is registered as a protected area under Norwegian law and is treated as a war grave, which means that the human remains of the 900-odd men who died inside the Tirpitz and were never recovered are given the same legal protection as a military cemetery. Divers visit the site. It is accessible from Tromsø and report seeing the distinctive curved sections of the ship's hull still in place, the mud around them layered with fragments of the materials that were dumped rather than salvaged. The cold, clear water of the Norwegian Arctic has preserved some of these fragments in remarkable condition. In the sediment, artifacts from the daily life of the ship's crew, pieces of crockery, fragments of equipment, personal items, are scattered in a field that a post-war generation is only now beginning to map with the precision the dead deserve. Chapter 16, The Strategic Balance Sheet. What did it all actually cost? The question of whether the Tirpitz campaign was worth its cost is one that historians have been arguing about, with varying degrees of intensity since the war ended. It is not a simple question, and it does not have a simple answer, because it requires simultaneous accounting in at least 3 different currencies: lives, resources, and strategic effect, none of which convert cleanly into the others. What we can do, with the historical evidence now available, is lay out the components of the calculation clearly enough that the reader can form a reasoned judgment, understanding that the historians who have studied this in the greatest depth have themselves reached a range of different conclusions. On the British side, the cost of the Tirpitz campaign must be measured across several different operations, spanning nearly 3 years. The RAF Bomber Command raids on Fjord in 1942. 6 major operations in March and April of that year involved hundreds of aircraft sorties and cost 12 bombers and their crews definitively, with additional aircraft damaged. Each bomber crew was 7 men. The carrier operations of 1944, Tungsten, Planet, Mascot, Brawn, Tiger Claw, and the Goodwood series, involved the deployment of the Home Fleet's carrier force on multiple occasions, at the cost of fuel, aircrew, aircraft losses and damage, and the operational wear on expensive vessels. Operation Source, the midget submarine attack, involved the loss of 4 X-craft and the deaths or capture of their crews. Operations Paravane, Obviate, and Catechism each required the deployment of heavy bomber forces at the very extremity of their range. The total British expenditure in lives, aircraft, and operational effort is not precisely calculable from the open historical record, but it was very substantial. On the other side of the ledger, the Tirpitz's existence imposed real costs on Britain for approximately 3 years, from January 1942 to November 1944. The British Home Fleet was required to maintain forces specifically configured to counter the threat that the Tirpitz might sortie. This typically meant keeping 1 or 2 capital ships at Scapa Flow at operational readiness, along with escorts at all times when the Tirpitz was known to be operational. The historian Angus Constam has estimated that the Tirpitz tied down a force roughly equivalent in cost to herself throughout this period. The more direct cost was the PQ-17 disaster in July of 1942, in which 21 of 37 merchant ships were sunk by aircraft and submarines. After the convoy was ordered to scatter specifically because of the threat of the Tirpitz, which, in the event, turned back without engaging. The losses in that convoy included an estimated 3,850 vehicles, 430 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft, materiel that the Soviet Union needed at a moment of acute crisis on the Eastern Front. 153 seamen died. The Tirpitz achieved all of this by threatening to sail. The historiographical debate about the final phase of the campaign. Operations Paravane, Obviate, and Catechism in the autumn of 1944 is particularly sharp. Several historians, including Angus Constam and Patrick Bishop, have argued that by April of 1944, after Operation Source and Operation Tungsten had between them crippled the ship's bow, disrupted her machinery, and killed or wounded nearly 500 of her crew, the Tirpitz no longer posed a meaningful offensive threat, and that the subsequent campaigns were driven more by Churchill's personal fixation on destroying the ship, and by the propaganda value of a visible success than by genuine strategic necessity. Others, including John Sweetman, have countered that British intelligence could not confirm the extent of the Tirpitz's damage with sufficient certainty to justify standing down the campaign, and that the possibility of the ship being towed to Germany and repaired remained a genuine concern through the summer of 1944. The official British intelligence history concludes, somewhat dryly, that Dönitz used the Tirpitz successfully to tie down Allied resources in her final period, and that in her last days she briefly excelled in her fleet-imbuing role. What is not in dispute is the strategic effect of the ship's destruction when it finally came. More than half of the Home Fleet's capital ship strength was redeployed within weeks of the sinking, principally to the British Pacific Fleet, which was assembling in preparation for operations against Japan. The battleship HMS Duke of York which had been kept in northern waters, specifically as a counter to the Tirpitz, proceeded to the Pacific. Multiple fleet carriers followed. This release of resources was tangible and rapid, and it contributes to the argument that the campaign was ultimately worthwhile, even if the timing and method of the final attacks may have been driven by considerations that went beyond purely military necessity. The human cost of the Tirpitz campaign, when totaled across both sides, is not a number that can be precisely established from the available records. On the German side, the 900-odd crew members killed in the sinking of the 12th of November are the most concentrated single loss, but they were not the only German dead attributable to the Tirpitz. The anti-aircraft crews killed in raids, the men lost in the X-craft countermeasures, the sailors who died in the various operational sorties. On the British and Allied side, the aircrew lost in the bombing raids, the X-craft crews killed in Operation Source, the naval personnel lost in convoy operations, disrupted by the Tirpitz's existence, and the merchant seamen of PQ-17 all contribute to a count that runs to several hundred at minimum, and almost certainly considerably higher. The Tirpitz was never the most lethal participant in the naval war in the North Atlantic and Arctic. That distinction belongs to the U-boats, to the aircraft that attacked convoys, and to the sea itself. But she was consequential, and the weight of consequences she generated was wildly disproportionate to the active role she actually played. In that disproportion lies the essential truth of the fleet in being concept, and the essential tragedy of it. Chapter 17, Memory. Commemoration and the long afterlife ships do not vanish when they sink. They continue in human memory, in official records, in the arguments of historians, in the places that bear their marks, and in the objects that survive them. The Tirpitz has an afterlife that is, in some respects, more complex and contested than her operational history, because the questions her existence raises about power, strategy, occupation, and the moral costs of modern warfare have not been definitively resolved, and probably cannot be. The most immediately personal dimension of the afterlife is the survivors' community. The men who served on the Tirpitz and survived the sinking held reunions for decades after the war, each year on the 12th of November, until at least 2014, according to the records. Survivors and their families gathered at the Ehrenfriedhof Cemetery in Wilhelmshaven, the old Imperial Navy port where the Tirpitz had been built, for a ceremony at the chapel. The small granite memorial slab there carries the names of the ship and the men who died with her. A modest monument for a vessel of such scale, but perhaps appropriate for a ship whose story has always been more about absence than presence, about what it represented rather than what it did. The ceremonies grew smaller as the survivors aged and died. The last of the original crew are gone now, or very nearly gone. The community has passed into family memory and institutional record. The Norwegian dimension of the commemoration is distinct and deserves separate attention. For the communities that lived alongside the Tirpitz during the occupation years, at Trondheim, at Narvik, at Alta, at Tromsø, the ship's memory is layered in ways that outsiders sometimes find difficult to understand. The Tirpitz was not merely a warship. She was the most visible symbol of the German occupation at its most confident, a physical embodiment of the power that had subdued the country and controlled its roads, its resources, and its daily life. The resistance operatives, who risked their lives to observe and report on her movements, did so in the full knowledge that discovery meant arrest, deportation, and death. The Norwegian civilians who hid their acetylene torches when the Germans came looking for cutting equipment on the morning of the 12th of November did so as an act of small, dignified refusal. The people who were arrested by the Gestapo for showing visible pleasure at the Tirpitz's sinking paid a direct price for the satisfaction of watching the occupier's symbol destroyed. The Tirpitz Museum at Fjord in Alta municipality in the far north of Norway occupies part of the site of the original anchorage, where the ship spent the longest portion of her Norwegian years. It houses photographs, equipment, personal items, and contextual displays about the occupation, the resistance, and the Allied operations against the ship. The museum is not primarily a monument to the ship itself. It is a monument to the people whose lives were shaped by her presence, including the Norwegian civilian population, the resistance operatives, and the German sailors who served aboard her as ordinary young men in the service of a state whose goals most of them did not personally choose. The distinction matters, and the Fjord Museum maintains it with a care that the subject demands. In Britain, the afterlife of the Tirpitz is entangled with the institutional rivalry between No. 9 Squadron and No. 617 Squadron that began on the afternoon of the 12th of November, 1944, while the Lancaster crews were still flying back to Scotland. Both squadrons claim credit for the bomb that actually sank the ship. No. 617 Squadron on the grounds that Wing Commander Tate's aircraft released the first tall boy, and that it was confirmed to have struck amidships, causing the critical damage. No. 9 Squadron on the grounds that, in their accounting, one of their bombs was responsible for the fatal damage. In 1950, the Norwegian government presented the RAF with a section of the Tirpitz's hull bulkhead, painted by the crew with a representation of the ship as a memorial to the raid. This object was installed at RAF Binbrook. It was subsequently stolen by No. 9 Squadron personnel and installed at their own unit headquarters. It was then stolen back and stolen again in a cycle of elaborate inter-unit larceny that continued for approximately 50 years before the object was handed to the Royal Air Force Museum in London in 2002, where it remains. The RAF Museum also holds a link from one of the Tirpitz's anchor chains. The bulkhead section and the anchor chain link are two of the more unexpected survivors of the whole campaign. Pieces of a German battleship, preserved in a British museum, as the physical residue of a rivalry between two squadrons of the Air Force that destroyed her. In Germany, the Tirpitz occupies an ambiguous place in popular historical memory. She is acknowledged as a remarkable feat of engineering and as the most powerful warship Germany ever built. She is remembered, particularly in the naval community, as a vessel whose crew served with courage and discipline in circumstances of considerable difficulty and frequent danger. The strategic failure of the surface fleet, of which the Tirpitz's operational inactivity was the most visible symptom, is treated with a mixture of historical honesty and institutional defensiveness that is characteristic of German military historiography's approach to the Second World War generally, acknowledging the failures while separating them, where possible, from the conduct of the individual officers and men who served in uniform. The men who served on the Tirpitz were not the men who made the decisions that led to the war, or to the occupation of Norway, or to the strategic choices that kept the ship in a fjord for 3 years instead of deploying her in any role commensurate with her cost. They were young men doing their service. The memorial in Wilhelmshaven honors them as such. The steel from the Tirpitz that was not melted down exists in scattered form across the world. Some armor plate, as noted, still covers road excavations in Oslo. Some material was worked by Norwegian craftsmen into knives. a fact that has achieved a certain minor celebrity in the online communities devoted to historical arms and militaria, where Tirpitz steel knives occupy a market position somewhat above mere novelty. Scientific instruments using low background steel from the wreck exist in medical and research facilities. The teak planking, reportedly used as fencing, would by now have rotted back into the ground near Tromsø. The bronze propellers that the German salvage crews removed in the winter of 1944 to 45 were melted down in German foundries and absorbed into the general production of a country already losing the war. The atoms of the Tirpitz are widely dispersed now, in roads, in instruments, in knives, in the bodies of Norwegians who ate fish from the fjord where the contaminated sediment still lies. Matter does not vanish. It simply changes state, changes form, changes purpose. The Tirpitz is still present. It is simply not concentrated anymore. Chapter 18. What the Tirpitz was. A final accounting. There is a temptation, at the end of a story this long, to offer a clean moral, to say that the Tirpitz proved this, or demonstrated that, about naval strategy, about the relationship between technology and power, about the nature of deterrence. This temptation should be resisted. History offers data, not lessons. The data from the Tirpitz's story is extensive and genuinely interesting, but it does not resolve into a single clean proposition. What it offers instead is a set of tensions between what the ship was and what it was used for, between the fear it generated and the violence it actually caused, between the strategic rationality of the fleet in being and the human cost of maintaining it, that are worth sitting with for a moment before the narrative closes. The Tirpitz was, on paper and in the water, an extraordinary object. The heaviest battleship ever built by a European nation. A vessel of 52,600 tons displacement, 251 meters in length, with armor up to 360 millimeters thick, and main guns capable of throwing 800-kilogram shells 36 kilometers. A crew of over 2,500 men trained to operate a weapons system of genuinely fearsome capability. The engineering that produced her at the Kriegsmarine Werft in Wilhelmshaven between 1936 and 1941 represents one of the peaks of 20th century heavy industrial manufacturing. A concentration of metallurgy, mechanical engineering, electrical systems, and naval architecture that, even accounting for the purposes it served, deserves recognition as a genuine technical achievement. The men who designed her, the workers who built her, the sailors who served on her, they made something of real magnitude. The question of what that magnitude was in service of is a separate one, and it is answered clearly enough by the history of the regime that ordered the ship built. The Tirpitz's operational record, stripped of the aura that surrounded her, is notably thin. One combat action against a weather station, one fleet-in-being deployment that tied down British forces, but required in exchange enormous German resources in fuel, personnel, logistical support, and anti-aircraft defense. The PQ-17 catastrophe, achieved without the Tirpitz firing a gun, represents the ship's only genuine offensive impact on the war. And that impact was created by the British Admiralty's own decision to scatter the convoy, not by any act the Tirpitz performed. The X-Craft attack, the Tungsten raid, the Tallboy operations, these were all British impositions on the Tirpitz's story, not chapters she chose. She was a target for almost her entire existence. This is not, as it might initially seem, a straightforward argument that she was useless. The fleet-in-being concept was not irrational. The resources Britain expended on containing the Tirpitz were real. The effect on convoy operations was real. The PQ-17 disaster was real. The argument that a weapon need not be fired to be effective is not merely a theoretical one. It is demonstrated by the Tirpitz's history with depressing clarity. The problem was not that Germany possessed the Tirpitz. The problem was that Germany built her for a navy that did not exist. The Plan Z fleet of 10 battleships and 4 carriers and more than 200 submarines that was never going to be ready by 1939, and that the outbreak of war rendered permanently hypothetical. The Tirpitz was designed to operate as part of a fleet. She was deployed as an isolated unit. The difference between those two situations is the difference between a chess piece in a functional position and a chess piece standing alone on an otherwise empty board, still powerful by itself, still demanding attention from the opponent, but unable to participate in the combinations that determine the outcome of the game. The RAF officers and bomber command crews who finally sank her had their own accounting to offer. Wing Commander Tate, the man who led Operation Catechism and whose aircraft dropped the first tall boy that struck the Tirpitz on the 12th of November, noted in his private papers that the operation had not contributed much to the Allied victory, as the battleship was already crippled. This assessment, from the man who personally delivered the fatal blow, is worth sitting with. He was right, in a narrow operational sense. The Tirpitz was not going to fight again, regardless of what happened on the 12th of November. And he was also, in a broader sense, wrong, because the Tirpitz had already contributed to the Allied victory in the negative sense by tying down resources for 3 years. And her destruction released those resources in a way that was immediately and concretely useful. The operation that Tate judged not to have contributed much liberated a fleet. The Norwegian people, the ones who watched from the Tromsø shore, the ones who had spent 4 years living alongside the occupation that the Tirpitz symbolized, the resistance operatives who had risked their lives to observe and report on her movements, had their own assessment, and it was simpler than either the strategic or the technical one. When the Tirpitz capsized in 11 minutes on the morning of the 12th of November, the Norwegians who watched it knew what it meant. It meant that the visible symbol of the power that had controlled their country for 4.5 years was gone. It meant that the war, which had seemed permanent for so long, could end. Several Norwegian civilians who expressed this publicly were arrested by the Gestapo within hours. The occupiers were still present, still organized, still possessed of the machinery of control. The Tirpitz sinking was not the liberation, but it was a sign, unmistakable and literal, that the forces sustaining the occupation were in the process of being destroyed. That sign had value that no strategic calculus captures cleanly. The wreck lies in the fjord off Hokoya Island still. The most recent surveys, conducted with remotely operated vehicles and acoustic mapping, show the surviving sections of hull embedded in the sediment, surrounded by the debris field of the post-war salvage operation. The seabed around it is contaminated with the chemical legacy of the ship and of the scrapping process. Deep in the sediment, below the reach of current technology, the remains of hundreds of men who never came home lie with the ship that was their station and their grave. Norwegian law protects the site. Divers visit it in summer, in the clear Arctic water, and look at what is left. In winter, in the darkness that lasts most of the day at that latitude, the fjord is very still, and the water is very cold, and the Tirpitz is very quiet. She spent 3 years as the loneliest warship in the world, anchored in a fjord, surrounded by mountains, protected by nets and smoke, and the geography of concealment. crew drilling and waiting and growing old in the service of a threat that was never executed. She was feared out of all proportion to her activity. She shaped a convoy war she never joined. She capsized in 11 minutes when the weapon designed to destroy her finally found her. And she left behind, in the cold sediment of a Norwegian fjord, the particular kind of historical residue that great ships always leave. Not a clean record of battles won or lost, but a long, complex human story that is still, even now, not entirely finished. You have reached the end of the Tirpitz's story. The fjord is quiet. The water is dark. If you are still here and still awake, thank you for the company. And if you drifted away somewhere along the way and are only returning now, that's all right too. The history kept its shape. It was here the whole time. Sleep well.